I see everyone joining in. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to 2025 Supply Chain Virtual Forum, our kickoff event for BC Supply Chain Week. This week marks a province-wide celebration of the professionals and organizations that keep British Columbia moving. We have an incredible morning ahead focused on our theme, strengthening supply chains through resilience and collaboration. As I see many of you are still joining, we'll begin by sharing a short message from someone who's been an instrumental role in shaping supply chain conversations in Western Canada. That is our President and CEO of Supply Chain Canada West, Alan Tope. The quick video would touch some powerful ideas about change, disruption, and importance of community in navigating uncertainty. Let's roll the video.
The rate of change that we're seeing today has never been this quick. We're going to continue to see change happening all around us, whether it's through the increased frequency of trade disruption, geopolitical risks, or even the impact of technology and artificial intelligence. This is all the reason why building communities, having all those connections, and working and leveraging and building off of these relationships that we have with one another is going to be able to help us through these turbulent times. A vibrant supply chain community allows supply chain professionals to really build off of the relationship we have with one another for support, for best practices, to learn from one another, and to share ideas. The recent experience with the tariffs, for instance, amazing effort by all those to come together to talk about what are you doing in your organization? What am I doing in my organization? How are we gonna deal with this? How do we change and move our supply chains around so that we can address these trade disruption risks and issues? That's the power of that community to be able to engage.
Awesome. This message really drives home what this forum is all about, essentially. From global trade disruptions to emerging technologies like AI, we are all navigating unprecedented complexity. But as Alan said, the strength of our supply chain community is the support, the conversations, and the shared solutions, and that is what helps us moving forward together. And since Alan is here with us today, I know he'll have even more to share with us as we go along. All right, great to see so many of you here. For those just joining, welcome again to 2025 Supply Chain Virtual Forum. Our theme for today is strengthening supply chains through resilience and collaboration. Before we dive into today's session, just a few quick housekeeping notes to make sure you have the best experience possible. Firstly, the forum is being recorded and all registrants will receive the recording. Some speakers have also agreed to share their presentation slides afterwards, so no need to take notes unless you would like to. As far as CPD credits are concerned, if you are a BC member attending today's session, your CPD credits will be automatically added. If you are from another province, please remember to manually update your Supply Chain Canada portal and add in your CPD credits yourself. All attendees are in listen-only mode to avoid background noise, but don't worry, each segment includes an interactive session where you can use the chat or Q&A feature or even raise your hand. At the bottom of your Zoom window, you should be able to see those options to engage with the speakers or the audience. All right, before we move ahead, I would like to quickly walk you through today's virtual forum program so you know what to expect. We'll be kicking things off shortly with opening remarks and land acknowledgement. followed by a rail transportation sector update from CN Rail, which sets the stage for understanding key infrastructure shifts in Canada. From there, we'll dive into topics that matter deeply in today's supply chain environment, like managing cost escalations, shifting from reactive to proactive ESG compliance, contract strategies amid uncertainty, and practical leadership tools to help you cut through complexity and drive impact. We have also carved out time for a short break so you can refresh and rejoin between sessions. It's a dynamic and insight-packed agenda, and we are excited to get started. So without further ado, I would now like to invite Alan Toh, President and CEO of Supply Chain Canada West, to deliver the opening remarks and perform the land acknowledgement to officially open today's forum. Alan, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jigar. It is truly my privilege to be the moderator today for our supply chain virtual forum. I want to welcome everyone from our supply chain community from coast to coast to coast. As we gather virtually from many places across Canada, we pause to acknowledge that we are meeting on the traditional lands of Indigenous peoples who have stewarded these territories for generations. Their knowledge system, trade routes, and relationships with the land and water lay the foundation for the movement of goods and the exchange of ideas that we now call supply chains. I want to recognize that healthy supply chains depend on healthy relationships with the land, with each other, and with all communities that we serve. And as we work to build resilient and sustainable supply chain for the future, we commit to listening, learning, and seeking partnerships that honor Indigenous rights, advance economic reconciliation, and contribute to shared prosperity across this country. So let's talk about this event today. Jigar, if you can just jump to the next slide here. And I want to maybe start off with just the proclamation itself. The proclamation from the province of British Columbia with all of you. While the language of the proclamation was originally focused on BC, its content certainly is applicable to supply chain across Canada. Let's take a look at the proclamation. That supply chains are vital to all people and organizations of all types and sizes, ensuring the availability of goods and services that sustain daily life and economic activity. And in times of uncertainty, trade disruption, or emergency, supply chains are even more critical as each day supply chain professionals like yourselves manage the movement of essential goods. And supply chain professionals are committed to sustainable and inclusive practices in order to support businesses and organizations in improving cost efficiency, leading innovation, driving economic growth, and increasing global competitiveness. This Supply Chain Week here in BC is a celebration. It's an opportunity to honor the contribution of supply chain professionals and to recognize the role of safeguarding supply continuity and ensuring a resilient supply chain industry. Now, let's take a moment to recognize the great work, the amazing work that our members and those within the supply chain sector do day in and day out. We have members joining us today from both public and private sectors representing Canada's diverse economy. And I want to thank all of you for your contribution and commitment to ongoing professional development and advancing really this profession and contributing to Canada's economic well-being. Additionally, I want to also acknowledge our newest annual sponsor, Fair Supply, and our virtual forum sponsor, Kinetic GPO. The support and commitment to our supply chain sector is greatly appreciated, and it truly allows us to perform many of our important activities. I also want to thank our partners for Supply Chain Week, CITT, Logistics BC, Langara College, and the province of British Columbia. Now, to officially open our virtual forum, I'd like to welcome my dear friend, Nicole Weiser from Kinetic GPO. Nicole, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Alan. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here virtually with all of you this morning. Kinetic GPO is thrilled to be part of your virtual forum and be a sponsor for you today, and to be part of your supply chain week. This is really exciting, and I look forward to some great conversations as the day progresses. So as Alan mentioned, my name is Nicole Wieser. I am a business development manager with Kinetic GPO, and today I have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker. She is the Assistant Vice President of International Intermodal for CN Rail, Corrine Kostyshyn, and I'm hoping that I did justice with your last name, Corrine. Apologies if that was not the correct pronunciation. I know I hear it all the time myself with my last name. As Assistant Vice President of International Intermodal, Corrine is responsible for all sales and marketing components of CN's international intermodal business. With over 25 years of experience in rail, logistics, and strategy, Corrine is a strong believer in collaboration and supporting a customer-centric focus, ensuring customers win in their markets. Prior to this role, Corrine has held a range of positions within CN, covering customer service, operations, finance, HR, and IT. I feel like that's quite a lengthy list. So there's definitely some knowledge that we'll be gaining from today's speaker with Corrine. Most recently, Corrine was the Director of Marketing of Industrial Products, accountable for all aspects of strategy and new product development in her portfolio, including developing the electric battery market and growth in the Northeast region of British Columbia. So without further ado, please, I pass it over here to Corrine and enjoy the presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nicole, and you did a great job on my last name, so kudos to you.
Thank you.
Definitely not everyone gets it right, so thank you for that. First of all, I want to say I really appreciate the opportunity to get to speak here today during BC Supply Chain Week. I think it's a great opportunity. I think sometimes rail can be a bit of a mystery to people, and I think this is a great opportunity to kind of open the dialogue and share a little bit about CN's background, and hopefully be the start of kind of bigger conversations moving forward, as it's clear supply chains are changing at a rapid pace based on kind of what's had happening in the last kind of 4 to 6 months. Before I get into my presentation, I will want to just take a moment. It also happens to be a Rail Safety Week here at CN. So I would just want to take an opportunity to take a moment. We always start off our customer presentations whenever we're in an internal meeting with the safety moment. So I'm just going to take a minute here and just do a safety moment for this group here. One thing I always find interesting is people's understanding of how long it actually takes for a train to stop. It can take over a mile for a train to stop. So, and they are surprisingly quiet. You think that a big train would make a lot of noise, but if the wind is blowing a certain way, or if you're distracted in any sort of way, you have something in your ears, or there's something else that you're kind of paying attention to, it could be very distracting. So my safety moment for everyone on the call today is, first of all, pay attention if you are around any sort of rail operation, and just know that it is big, heavy, and it takes a long time to stop. So don't misjudge trying to beat something across the tracks, or trying to take a picture on rail tracks because you think it's a really great, moment. I would strongly discourage that, and just always be aware of rail safety, because we really do take it seriously. Okay, so with that, I'll just get started here. Perfect. So what I plan to talk about today was get a little bit into kind of who CN is a little bit, and kind of what we're about, and what we some opportunities to maybe engage with our customers, in terms of supply chain. I think the first thing I want to say is that the landscape is changing. You heard that in the opening remarks, and definitely I think on a day-to-day basis, I know one of the first things I do is kind of open up when I open up my phone in the morning, okay, I'm like, what happened? Like what's different? What new tariffs in place? What new, what's changed in the world today? Because our network, is definitely impacted by that. CN Rail, we touch 3 coasts. We touch the west coast of Canada, the east coast of Canada, and into the Gulf of Mexico. We move a lot of different commodities. We show here 180 different commodity types, but truly it can be beyond that, because the things in the boxes itself for intermodal can range quite significantly. But I think the most important thing that I want to point out is that for the most part, CN is truly a really strong origination franchise. We have our network reaches into some really northern parts of the Canadian landscape, and that provides us access to specific types of commodities that maybe not everybody has access to. So we originate a lot of the traffic that we move on our network. And because of that, I think the big thing that would make sense to folks is to understand, as an origination franchise for years, a lot of that product would move, would go south of the border. About 30% of our volumes move south of the border. But things are changing. And really, as supply chain professionals, our job, our responsibility is to really provide our customers with a sense of optionality. And so with that, I'm always advocate with whatever role I've been in, is to always bring your supply chain expert to the table early and often. And within that, you really always want to encourage a conversation that is open and honest, because supply chains will give our customers different ideas on where from where they move their product today to where they can move their product going forward. And our network really speaks to that. We have options for customers. Yeah, we can get your product into the US, but we can also get your product to various offshore locations. And it's just a matter of kind of understanding what that looks like and what that means. So, hold on here. Okay. So a little bit about, a little trigger happy there. Give me 2 seconds. Okay. So a little bit about CN in of itself. So CN, as I said, our role is to connect our customers to their markets and to provide that optionality. We are a large organization. We have over 24,000 employees. Our market cap last year was over $92 billion. We have over 18,000 route miles. We move a lot of stuff. But we really are still only a small percentage of the overall supply chains. There's a lot that move over the road. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to kind of look at different ways to move goods across Canada and the US and beyond. A big portion of what we end up moving over our 18,000 route miles moves south of the border. About a third of it right now moves south of the border. But as you saw recently within the announcements made by the federal government, there's an interest in opportunities to move and for ports to play a bigger role for looking for different markets for goods to move offshore. About 85% of our capital, and this last year we spent $3.4 billion in capital. This year we're going to spend last year we spent 3.5. This year we're spending $3.4 billion in capital. And that investment, a large chunk of it, about 85% of it, goes into maintaining and building out our infrastructure. We have a lot of, it's a lot to build out the rail and the tracks. So we spend a lot of locomotive and rolling stock. So within that, we're open for business. And I'll get into a little bit more about some of the capacity and availability that we have with that kind of going forward here in this. The one thing I often say to my team right now, or different opportunities I have to speak to different supply chain experts, is as this pivots, as our economy is shifting and changing and our customers are looking for where different markets to go to, I often think to a quote by Wayne Gretzky, skate to where the puck is going, not to where it's been. And I think that's really the interesting part of being in supply chain right now. We know how things have always moved in the past, and really what we need to do is set ourselves up to understand and focus on where we can move things going forward. So just a bit more background on CN Rail. We really do have a very diversified portfolio, and we move a lot of different products to a lot of different places. The group I'm in now, International Intermodal, We move about 13% of the goods that on our network are tied to international intermodal. But we have a large section of our business that ties into moving petroleum and chemicals. So a lot of stuff that move out of Alberta, going into BC and going to other parts of Canada and the US, move on us. Grains and fertilizers, obviously the grain crops just coming off, we're a big player in that. The forest products segment, this is something that's, you know, rapidly changing, and they're pivoting and kind of figuring out what the world will look like with some of the announcements that have been made in the last 3 to 4 months. Metals and minerals was the group that I just came from, and that's where I got heavily involved with mining and supply chains. I think there's a lot of opportunity in there for Canada to really have a place in the world stage. And within that, I think that supply chain is a critical part of that. We would often have conversations with customers and early on in their mining permitting stage to say, listen, you don't need to have us at the table at every meeting, but do have us at the table, because you want to figure out solutions that are really going to work for the long term. You want to think about things that you're not going to have this heavy operating expense once you're up and running, because you didn't take time to kind of plan the capital around an efficient way for your supply chain to operate. So I'm a big believer that there's growth and upside there. We move obviously a variety of other products too, automotive, coal, and of course my counterpart in domestic intermodal is a big part of the story as well. On the map on the right-hand side, you will see the kind of different the thickness to the red lines. The thickest of the red lines really refers to the fact that we have it's where the largest portion, the heaviest portion of rail transportation happens. So we move a lot of goods to and from Western Canada. That's the biggest part of it. So we spend a lot of capital ensuring that we have continuing to have increased capacity to be able to handle that those product movements, you know, now and kind of into the future. The opportunity for growth and where we have a lot where we definitely have room to grow really is tied to the east and into the southern parts of our network. That doesn't mean that we are not, we actively look at business opportunities across the board, whether it wherever on our network that that a customer is looking for. But just in terms of current state, this is what we have right now. I apologize if there were questions or if there's something I'm missing. I can't see it at this point in time, so I'll just continue to move forward. If someone wants to interrupt me, if there's a question that I need to cover, I'd be happy to do so. The one other point I will make on this is that although you see our network kind of laid out this way, for those that are less familiar with rail transportation, please do note that railroads do work with each other. So there are counterparts within Canada and throughout the US that if you have goods that want to move into, say, Atlanta or Phoenix or some different type of a market, it doesn't mean that because you don't originate with us, that you can't that you can't work with the railroads to get your products there. Railroads have a long history of working together and collaborating to get products into different markets. So it's definitely a part of the solution moving forward. And as I spoke a little bit earlier about some of the thickness of the red lines and the capital investments, this slide here is just to highlight some of the focus that we've had with building out the capacity in our western part of our network. We have a variety of siding projects and a variety of projects to increase throughput in various parts of the network based on what we understand of the feedback from our customers, you know, that are looking at either doubling down on current markets or growing into new markets. So we spend a lot of time and energy and figuring out and making sure that no other customer is involved. No other customer is impacted when we take on that growth, and that we continue to have the ability to move all these products throughout any corridor that a customer kind of needs us to move that through.
Corrine, just for the sake of some of our members, audience who may not be familiar with the term, can you maybe describe siding projects a little bit more?
Sure. Thank you for that. So a rail lines are not like a highway where you have kind of one going east and one going west. There's parts of the network that are literally a track. So depending on the density of the traffic, how much traffic you have moving over that track, depends on whether you want to put kind of a 2-lane highway in that part of the network. What you usually try to do, track is extremely expensive to put in. So what you try to do is time where you put that 2-lane highway to make sure that it makes sense for where you're likely that the one train will meet the next train. And so that's where, when you have sidings, it increases your overall throughput, because you have a place that you can kind of have that 2-lane highway, and then you have a place that it's back to single lane, and you operate with that with greater fluidity. Does that make sense? I hope that helps.
It does. Perfect. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Okay. Once again, just a bit of a breakdown that we had in British Columbia specifically. Last year, we'd spent over $500 million on capital investments within the province of British Columbia. It tends to be one of the more heavily focused areas where we see growth happening, in large part because there's a big dependence and customers are very interested in using both the Port of Vancouver and the Port of Prince Rupert. And there's a lot of different initiatives that are happening kind of through those ports that really have generated this need for increased spending in that region. So we spend, as you can see, we spend quite a bit of money in British Columbia, but we spend a large amount of capital in all provinces across Canada and in the US as well. And we always take a look, and we spend a lot of time talking to our customers to understand where is their growth coming from and where is their growth going to. It takes time to build out track. It takes time to buy locomotives. It takes time to hire and train the people who drive the trains. So we spend a lot of time with our customers understanding not only kind of what's in the here and now, but what do they see kind of going forward, and what should we be planning for as a part of that conversation. If there is a new massive mine opening up at some port at a point in Western Canada, what will that mean, and how does that fit within our existing plan, and what do we have to do to help ensure that that moves with a certain fluidity that our customers would expect. So I saw this quote the other day, and I thought it was very true, that products can easily be copied, but a supply chain can provide a true competitive advantage. And I am a really strong believer in that statement. I believe that supply chains, when thought through properly, can really provide for really creative solutions and get customers and set up customers for success through optionality, through having a more cost competitive solution. And so, as I said earlier, I really always encourage customers at earlier stages of something that's kind of starting, to have their supply chain professionals at the table so they can understand that. More often than not, I've been in more than one situation where a customer kind of calls at the, we're opening up in 4 weeks from now, what can you do for us? And, we always try to find a solution, but if we would have spoken a bit earlier on, we could have provided some different maybe optionality that, required a bit more planning. That would have been a better solution long term, because truly that's what you want. You want the customer to be able to have a long-term viable solution that makes them competitive in the market for years to come. And that just can't underscore that notion of optionality enough, because things will always happen in supply chains. That's kind of a normal part and parcel of it. But if you have an optionality built into your solution, then you have ways to kind of mitigate that risk. And I think everybody, in the last 5 or 6 years understands what risk can look like when the world is flipped on its head. And you really want to have that kind of in your back pocket and well established before those situations occur. So for those that are thinking, well, geez, I have a customer, or my customer, who I work with doesn't have a rail siding, and that rail siding is not really an option for us. We're too far away from where the rail track is laid. I just wanted to bring attention to the fact that we actually have across our network a variety of what we call distribution centers. And those distribution centers are ways that we work with our customers who maybe are not on rail or don't have the volume to support a direct rail solution, where they can bring their product to a distribution center, load it into a rail car, then go for further into different markets. So there's a variety of facilities across our network that supply that service. Some are specific to a commodity, so you have some that will just say handle more liquid type products, so like grain or gas and diesel or things like that. And then you have others that will, be more focused on moving lumber or steel or so on and so forth. But we do have a variety of networks that a network that's out there already that can support those solutions if you're looking for a carload solution to move product by. The other thing that we also have is what we call rail ready sites. So we basically have a catalog of locations across our network that are a different size and scale to if a customer is looking at building something and where rail access is extremely important. We have some sites, you can go into the website and take a look at it. And those sites already kind of show that there is rail access to the site. And we could, we can work with them to kind of understand how you would set the track layout to it and so on and so forth. But if that's a part of what you're interested in or a customer is interested in looking for, that also is an option available out there. And last but not least, I just wanted to say if there are any questions or any opportunities that people see with connecting with CN Rail for business, sales@cn.ca is where those questions can be easily directed to. We have a large group of professional logistics professionals at CN that can definitely work to give you kind of what options are available and what you can kind of do to maybe look at different rail moving forward.
Wonderful. Corrine, thank you so much. We've got a number of questions from our audience. I'll just maybe read out the first one here from Chris. So from northern BC perspective, there is much opportunity for transportation of products from mining and forestry. The concern that Chris hears is that the rail lines are primarily concerned with Eastern Canada to Western ports, and hook and haul is an issue due to current volume. Is CN looking to expand the rail line to accommodate building new investments to support Northern BC?
So Northern BC, particularly Northeastern BC, was actually a project I was heavily involved with. And we have been developing with our customers a variety of solutions for some, depending on the product, but this product I was specifically involved with, there had been multiple customers have been building out infrastructure to support their growth. And then we had complemented that by our own capacity projects within Northeastern BC to as well support that. Without knowing the details of kind of what is being looked at to move or, what the details around it, I would say, we are always open to that conversation. We realize not everybody can have a full unit train of product ready to go. So that's not always the most, important solution. And I also just say it's a hard place to start. Like you got to be a pretty big company on day one to be operating a unit train. So we want to work with our customers in the early days and kind of develop the market in a way that allows them to grow. So it is something that we definitely do work with our customers on. I've not kind of heard of anyone dissuading traffic to go if it has to come from the east. That's not it. There's more capacity easily available in the east, but we by no means shut off opportunities in the west. Hope that
Wonderful.
answers your question.
And another capacity type of question
Sure.
is as Canada looks to increase trade to Asia, how might this affect the capacity at CN? And is this part of your planning strategies as well as you look to back to the quote of Wayne Gretzky, seeing where the puck is going to move?
Yeah, we're really excited by the announcements that have come forward by the federal government and their interest in some of these projects. I think for, a long time, the conversation that we had with our customers was really a north-south conversation. And I definitely see us increasing and having more east-west conversations. I think the federal government announcements on some of these different port initiatives that they are looking at kind of supporting or getting behind with their new project office is a sign that there is going to be more interest in kind of an east-west movement. And that, that's kind of going back to where we started to some degree. That's what our network had always kind of originally had and was a part of. And we're very well positioned to support our customers that are going to be changing with that.
Absolutely. And just I'm just looking up here and
Yep.
actually, the amount of investments made by rail companies have been quite significant in terms of infrastructure investment. And as Corrine talks to the investment that CN has made, I think overall Canadian rail companies have well invested over $23 billion in the past decade alone on infrastructure. And interesting enough, as I was looking into this, overall rates have been fairly stable. And when we compare rail rates against inflation, rail rates has actually been below changes to the consumer price index. So really interesting piece of information there to our members. One of the things that is near and dear, and I guess on the news right now, is this trade dispute with the U.S. and China. Can you maybe talk to the impact of this as you sort of see it from a rail perspective?
Yeah, uncertainty is never a good thing for our customers. And if it's not good for customers, it's not good for us. And so what this trade conversation or this tariff conversation is introduced was a lot of uncertainty and customers just really not clear on what windows they had and what the end product would end up looking like. I actually have on my whiteboard a place where I put what the current tariff rate is because it was changing so often, like it was hard to keep track of. For international intermodal, kind of where I sit today, these windows, these 90-day pauses and whatnot really shifted some things of how the customers viewed. They needed to get their products landed on US soil by a specific date so that it created some challenges considering you get it on Canadian soil and you move it into the US. It created some challenges with that shift that we've been working through with them. But I just think that the uncertainty and the customers don't know what will change in terms of consumer spending. Will people still be buying the same amount? Will that, that whatever they used to pay $100 for, if they have to pay $150, does that no longer make it a desirable product for them? So I think we're just kind of figuring that out. Inventory levels overall still look pretty stable, but I don't sure what the consumption, we're not clear what the consumption rate is of consumers across Canada and the US to kind of complement what's currently being stored out there today. So it's still kind of a work in progress. And unfortunately, no real end in sight.
Absolutely. Corrine, there's another question from our audience from John, and he just made a comment around looking at looking at the map that you presented. Why is there no rail from BC going down to Washington, Oregon, and California? And maybe if you can speak to sort of the rail infrastructure and CPKC versus CN and how the two rail companies work together.
Yeah. So as I said, rail, I showed the map that highlighted CN. There are rail maps out there that actually show a much more broad infrastructure that exists out there that do have opportunities to kind of have you connect through Vancouver into Washington State and further into the U.S. West Coast. We work collaboratively with those rail carriers and the smaller rail carriers out there on a regular basis so that we can actually get the product to the end markets that our customers require us to. So there is an existing infrastructure that kind of we partner with to build brand new rail. Is not a cheap, is not for the faint of heart. Once you get past the issue of permitting and acquiring kind of the land necessary to to build what needs to be built, it is a very, very expensive venture. So we try to figure out alternative solutions to how customers can move their product into those markets. And there are a variety of things, as I said, like the transloads that exist today that can kind of sometimes get your product to or from a specific origin to another destination, that where you truck those last miles. You know, or like I said, working with other class 1 carriers to do that. But it is, I know I had that conversation a lot with mining companies. We'll just build the rail into my line. I'm like, that, you know, you're spending a lot of money on something that it would take a lot of volume to really substantiate and make that investment worth anyone's while.
Perfect. And oh my goodness, the time is up already. Corrine, thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you for all the insights.
Thank you very much for having me today. It was an absolute pleasure. Appreciate the opportunity.
Wonderful. Okay, let's introduce our next speaker. And so at this point in time, I'd like to welcome Larry Berglund as our next speaker. Let's get over to Larry's slide there. Fantastic. So Larry holds the Distinguished Fellow of Supply Chain Management Association title through his long career contribution to Supply Chain Canada and the advancement of our profession. Larry has held, and I think if you were to look at the next slide, and I'll just sort of progress it there too, is he's held so many leadership positions across many sectors in his career, including forestry, public health care, municipal government, universities, and consulting. And in addition to that, he has facilitated many times with Supply Chain Canada on a number of topics there, all of which you see on your very far left. He is an author. He is an amazing presenter and a distinguished speaker. So I am really, really excited to have Larry here to speak on the topic of indexing techniques to manage price escalation and volatility for buyers. So with that, Larry, I'll pass the presentation to you.
All right. Thank you, Alan. And Alan, as you were going to mention, I'm also a songwriter, a published songwriter this year, which I'm happy to share with everybody. So you got to have be able to pivot and have your plan B.
Amazing work.
All right. So what I just want to talk about today is particularly as Corrine talked about, is the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity in the marketplace today. I'm going to show you a model that I developed a number of years ago called the price index model. The impetus for it was when we joined a national healthcare buying organization. We were promised a 10% saving. So about a year later, went back to see if we could measure it, and I found the results were about a 7%, very good. But then I asked, if I hadn't joined this national buying group, what did my other costs outside of this contract, how were they affected? And they, due to various market variations, went down about 3-4%. So it was a net savings for sure. But I thought we need more information here to really manage and measure our costs, and particularly with incremental changes. In today's market, again, as Corrine talked about, there is so much noise, tariffs, it's hitting everybody. The sky is falling, but somewhere it's got to translate into an aggregate line-by-line value into your supply chain cost management strategy. So that's what I'm going to walk you through at a fairly quick pace because I've got about 30 minutes to cover this. And everybody's boss went and majored at the same course in university, and that course was, what the hell have you done for me lately? That's what every boss asks all of their procurement people. So why are your costs rising? Can you find more competitive suppliers? How are you managing our costs? And this is part of the challenge that we have as supply professionals on a day-to-day basis. So the weighted price index model takes a typical basket of goods approach, and whether you've got 100 SKUs, 5,000, 10,000 SKUs, it typically falls into a variety of categories or commodities, so you can manage them as an aggregate basket. And the data you need to collect, which you have out of your systems, is the annual volume for each item and the price for each item. And then you calculate the aggregate value of the basket. The challenge we always have is volume always changes, prices are always changing. So how can we actually find a method to take all of this information and measure where we are. And based on that information, can we adapt our sourcing strategies around it? And that's what I'm going to walk you through as we go through this. So I've kept this really simple. So we've got 10 SKUs in this organization we call Company A. And this is their costs over a 3-year period. So they got the 10 SKUs, and there's the year 1 volume by unit. So item 1, they've got number 12 safety gloves. They buy 50,000 of them. There's the price for year 1, year 2, year 3, typical price movements and everything else. What's interesting, and this is key, we lock the volume in for year 1. Now we know volumes always change, but to come up with an index like CPI, et cetera, producer price index, et cetera, we lock in a volume and then compare incremental shifts on pricing against the same volume. So if with item number 1, we now started to buy 100,000 gloves, obviously we could probably get a negotiated price difference. What we do as an index value is we lock in the volume of pricing, and I'll show you how we can deal with changes in volume over time as we move through this model. And Alan or Jigger, please keep track of the time because I could talk the leg off a turkey going through some of this stuff. So how well is Company A managing its costs? And from that previous slide, just to go back, just to show you where they were, you can see that of those 10 items, we've had price changes all over the place. So how well are they managing them? The answer at this point is we really don't know. We need to have a better way of extracting and making some comparisons with this data. So let's take the Company A information I just showed you, and we'll create an index value. All right. Now, oh my gosh, this looks like a Technicolor slide. It's very simple in a sense, but all I've done is put in the mnemonics for each one of the statements that we covered. So we still only have the 10 items. They're all there again. The volume for year 1 and the cost for year 1 for each one. And I've extrapolated the costs across the board for all 10 items for all of the 3 years that we're showing here. So when we do year 1, it shows us that as an index value, we simply assign it a value of 1. So any changing in pricing attached to those specific items will affect the overall basket of goods and therefore our index value. So year 2 turns out to be 1.13. That intuitively tells us prices have gone up about 13%. I'm being dramatic with some of the numbers just to give us a sense. Although in some of the markets you're dealing with today, the prices will be going up much more substantially. We created this model in advance of the 2010 Olympics, and we had price increases going up 25, 30% within 1 year. So these are not out of line, particularly in the volatile markets that we are experiencing today. So with an index, it's easy to construct. You typically take most of the goods you're buying all the time out of your MRP system or SAP, whatever you've got. You simply look at the volumes on an annual basis for them or project them, the actual costs out of the system. And your IT people can set up what's called a script, and they can easily update your pricing each month and give you a sense of what your trends are going to be. So when we do year 1, we have a snapshot of what our costs are. It's almost meaningless as an index at that point. When we start to juxtapose year 2, year 3, we now start to see a trend. So we need the snapshot, measure the incremental changes in pricing against the same basket of goods at the same volume, and then we have a trend which will develop out of that. So let's just move forward here a little bit. And let's look at the Company A price information for year 4. And in year 4, there's the same 10 items, and there's the costs. Well, what is the impact on our model in year 4? And this is where this is set up typically in an Excel sheet, maybe old school, but it works like a hot damn and it's cheap. So we simply load in the year 4 data into our original slide, and it pops out right there. All we do is layer it in the prices, and we can see now that the year 4 index value is 1.17. So a pretty substantial increase. And there's how it looks on the graph. And you can make the graph at whatever dimensions you want for your axes values there. So we can now see that how well is this company managing its costs. We now start to have some questions. So this is about where I got when we joined the National Healthcare Buying Organization. Okay, I can see the price is changing, but what other information do I need to continue to have objective data to shape some of the strategies going forward? And so, just waiting for the slide to advance here. So how do you think company A is performing with its cost management? And again, the answer seems to be, we really don't know at this point. We need to look at some cost drivers. And everybody on the session today are all going to have their costs affected by several key components. Almost all of them are going to be common to everybody on the session today, whether you're working for CN or TELUS or Ralph's Tire Company. There's things that drive our costs that are literally beyond our control as individual companies, but we need to factor that into our strategies. What affects our costs? Energy costs are certainly one of them. Whether you're on electric, hydro, you've got solar panels you're investing. And so this starts to shape our investments. If our energy costs are going up dramatically and we have a lower cost source of energy, that would change our cost structure overall. And if our suppliers invest in lower cost energy solutions, their customers should also benefit from that. Key commodities, look at any commodities you've got globally here, copper, lithium, etc. Now, 3-4 years ago, lithium and a lot of the critical minerals were being bought out 10 years by the battery companies. The EV market is slowing down dramatically. The price of some of these commodities has collapsed dramatically while others have increased dramatically as well. This always goes on. So we factor this into cost. You as an individual buyer for your organization cannot control commodity costs. You're driven by the global market. As Corrine talked about, the geopolitical events are outside of our control, but we can measure that, and therefore we can make better informed decisions around them. Exchange rates. Canada is an unfavorable exchange rate right now with the United States. This will change over time. Remember, at one point, the US and Canadian dollar were at par a number of years ago, admittedly, but these things will change. But look at exchange rates out of Europe, Southeast Asia. These are all going to impact our sourcing decisions. Our ability to negotiate and the competencies and expertise of the staff we have to go out and negotiate on behalf of the organizations has a huge impact on our cost structure. The competitive bid process that we run, are they appropriate to run competitive bids right now? In a market where everybody's going full blast, you may be better off negotiating than trying to run some competitive bids. Look at your ability to manage your contracts. Very, very important these days. And it's not for the faint of heart, as Corrine said as well. So we need to be able to have good, effective contract management expertise on hand. The talent of purchasing staff, investing in the people in our organizations gives us a strength. And it's the old adage, if we train them, they might leave. If we don't train them and they stay, are we better off? That's the argument that goes on. The cost of money, the monetary policies of the federal, provincial, and your local banking institutions affects the cost of inventory and everything else doing business. If the US federal bank reduces its cost of borrowing in the next month, that will have a huge ripple effect right across North America and everywhere else, and in Canada as well. The efficiency of our suppliers. This is a really interesting one. As various suppliers invest in technology, AI, robotics, their efficiencies go into two places, either their own pockets for profits, or due to competition, they have to pass along the savings for the competitive needs in the marketplace to remain competitive. So if you're dealing with inefficient suppliers, you pay more. How do you know whether you are or not until you do some tests in the market? So the local and global economies, which are in flux right now. We've got the BRICS nations against the free world per se. It's going to be very dynamic over the next 5 to 10 years. These are long-term strategies that unfold here. And your organizational, environmental, social, and governance policies. If you're going to commit fully to ensuring that your supply chain is free of any form of child labor or meeting all current environmental standards, that may cost you a couple of points, or it may save you money. But these are all things that affect the cost of everybody online doing business and all of our suppliers, etc. We can't escape these sorts of issues. So let's set up an index for the relevant cost drivers using my company A example. And what would affect that? So when you're looking at ladders and gloves and plastic items, some of the main costs there would be, the drivers would be West Coast crude, which is available in the public domain. Raw cowhide is traded, and I put in the Canadian US dollar exchange rate for the same years, year 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so we can see as we track it that we've got some very dynamic changes going on. We can see that raw cowhide has gone up dramatically 2.5 times over what we were paying. The Canadian exchange is smaller. So if we are making products or selling products that contain leather, we are now up against a situation where it's almost impossible for us to do anything really dramatically if we're going to source leather. Now, if we've been buying, for example, Canadian or US leather products, maybe we could source rawhide from South America, Brazil. That could have another change in our cost structure and the index. So the cost drivers now we can see have changed dramatically. And that's an interesting thing just in itself. And we'll come back to how we factor this information into our analytics. So let's benchmark the key cost drivers and the company A in-house price index. So that's what we're going to show you here. This is where I sort of say that the price index model is like your golf game. You can be a terrible golfer and go out and have lots of fun with your fellow golfers who are much better than you. And you don't compare yourself against the best golfer. You typically compare yourself against your own score that you've had, whatever your handicap is. When you're playing golf with friends, you're not playing for money. It's much different. The price index, we're not playing with friends. We're playing with money against competition. So we need to be a bit more objective as we look at this. So the golf metaphor works to a certain degree. But the point is, when we develop an in-house price index, that's our internal scorecard as to how well we're doing. So when we look at this here, we can see the Texas crude has gone up double, raw cowhide almost 2.5 times, and the US exchange rate 6%. The company A's performance internally has increased its cost 17%. So that's a lot of inflation internally driven by the procurement strategies that are in place. So what else can we do with this information here? We'll look at external indices. And this is where I was when I worked in healthcare and we joined the buying group. Can we look at external indices and compare our internal costs to external consumer price index or the producer price index? And most producer price index values are more relevant to what goes on in industry and business. CPI is consumer based primarily. If you're in the retail, it's certainly a good one. So when we now compare the aggregate values of our company A internal price index, the CPI, and the PPI, we can see that company A's costs are exceeding significantly other external indices, telling us that, you know what, the company to be profitable and comparable in competition with its other competitors needs to reduce its costs somewhere about 8%. That could mean we get out of the leather glove business and we replace it with some synthetic glove business that's much more competitive. Likely, we look at what our competition is doing as we hear in the marketplace as well. So this tells us that as good of a team that company A has on its procurement side, its marketing and sale, it's beyond the control of the buying side, of the demand side, to be able to control the cost more than they're doing. There's always 1 or 2% here and there. When we start to see 8% cost increases over and above external indices, that tells us we're in a really difficult situation here, and we've got to do something. The boss can't come in and say, you've got to get the price down on our index down to, say, 1.10. Likely you won't be able to do it without some dramatic changes. So objectively, we can see that company A costs are exceeding other indices. But company A now has a target. And without having these indices, company A would simply look at its scorecard and see that, gee, the prices are going up. What are we going to do? Without information to see that the other drivers and the other indices are not as inflationary as our company costs are. So we need to develop strategies to mitigate the rising costs, including dropping some product lines, could be one of them. Excuse me. If this was your core product, you may have to look at rethinking your business there, developing other sources for raw materials. This is what the long-term effect of the tariffs are from the United States. And I think this is very important. Most organizations have become complacent upon US sales and sourcing, and we're now getting the signals that we're not in Kansas anymore. We need to find other reliable, resilient resources in order to be competitive in the long term. That is likely going to cause us to transition away from some traditional sourcing and look at new markets. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations will likely have an agreement with Canada by the end of the year or shortly after. That's a whole new source, tariff-free in a sense, and we need to look at where we can be more competitive with our global sourcing. I guess the best thing to come out of this 2025 nightmare is the fact that we have become complacent, but I think for the right reasons. We had a strong, long-term, multi-decade partner who's now says, no, we don't want that anymore. So when your major customer and supplier often develops an isolationist policy, we need to also have some counter punch for this. So developing other sources of raw materials or sourcing is critical. Looking at substitute materials is going to be very critical with this. We can see it we've seen this many times with environmental products. Toyota changed one of their critical materials in their mufflers to condense the gas vapors. When they changed to a different material, the price of their platinum dropped overnight. So you may have to look at dropping product lines also to protect profit. So keep in mind, we don't know what your competition is doing as well. So we're constantly trying to gather information from the market in order to be as competitive as we can be. Now, when we have those 10 items and you've got a price index, what if you stopped buying one of those items or completely changed the sourcing? And what would that do to our index value? Now, keep in mind, this is the important piece about with the Gulf metaphor. You're now changing your own scorecard. So I'm going to show you, what if in year 2 we stop selling one type of tool belt and we switch to another? Well, from an index value, it's super easy to change it. So there we are, item 3, and we simply change the tool belt. We can go back to year 1 and change our own numbers and show what the impact would be overall in our index value. As a general rule with a price index, you want to keep your list of key commodities or categories or items fairly stable. If you change them each year, each month, it's going to be of limited value as an index value. So as a weighted price index, it's great to keep the items stable as you can. But if you change the major product or switch from, let's just say, a GM to a Ford, that would have tremendous across the board changes. But your index is really easy to update. Very simple to do this stuff. Alan, am I running out of time? How am I doing here? Okay.
Yeah, I'm just popping in just to let you
Okay.
know that we've got 5 minutes left in this segment.
Oh, all right. Okay, thank you. Thank you. All right. So the price index that you develop internally for your organization is your scorecard. Doesn't matter what your competition's doing. First of all, you got to know what you're doing. You report this information out to senior management. When I was with one large city, we did this monthly. We literally got the engineering to pay attention, which is not easy to do. And we changed our sourcing strategies, key commodities, copper being one of them, formulation for making cement and road pavement, etc. Report out to your other department managers. Be proactive. Don't wait till the year end to find out that it's costing too much money. Give them monthly updates. This provided input for budgets as well. It showed procurement staff how their jobs change the aggregate value of your organization's cost of supplies. Public sector or private sector applications, I've done it for both, and it works extremely well. It can be applied to sales or procurement data. You can break it down just by maintenance, repair, and operating. We only want the electrical supplies. We only want the operating supplies. We only want the electrical items. You can do it with those sub-commodities as well. And it helps to develop appropriate strategies for competitiveness right across your organization. So how are budgets set in your organization? Normally they take the CPI, and that's what you hope to get each year, when we know, in fact, 2025 is just going to be a wild card. Most organizations use CPI. Sales organizations love CPI because it always goes up. CPI adjustment factor is easy to apply. So the price index will provide much more accurate data for your organization to make switches on. This slide is simply there to show the periods of deflation versus inflation. Believe it or not, from about 20 to 24, we had a period of deflation in many areas, arguably, and now we're experiencing an unknown outcome in terms of how inflation is going to be affecting us over the next 3.5 years. There's going to have to be some change in course by various countries around this as well, and as well as Canada. So the benefits of a price index model from a professional supply chain perspective: objective reporting is more credible with senior management. Use the PPI rather than CPI for price reviews on your contracts for suppliers. Break it down for your maintenance, repair, and operating costs. It helps your end user departments develop their own cost estimates, which you have to live with as well. Awareness helps staff to understand their roles and how it affects the cost of your organization. It increases an understanding of suppliers' costs. Believe me, most suppliers, particularly the salespeople, have no idea how their company came up with the prices they are. So now we get into this thing called target costing. And you can look at the annual budget process. We challenged a major city's budget process and won the argument, showing that it was completely out of touch when they applied CPI blanket across the board. Objective information helps develop contracting strategies. Benchmarking with other organizations and indices gives a sense of effectiveness. One challenge I'd like to throw to anybody in the public sector, anybody in municipality as an example: compare your costs to other municipalities. It's just objective. It's not who does better than somebody else. It's simply objective comparisons. Sourcing strategies need to be adjusted for periods of inflation versus deflation. Very important to do that. If you want more details, you can go to larryberglund.com, find the article, click on the article, Procurement, What Have You Done For Me Lately? That's an article I wrote with B2B a couple of years ago. So it's got everything I talked about in the last 30 minutes as fast as I could in more detail for you. Alan.
Amazing. And you finished on time. Holy smokes. Well done, Larry. You know, the topic is an important one because more often than not, as I go out and meet with various supply chain organizations, one of the tools that supply chain professionals have in their toolkit is obviously the go to market. I'm going to go to market. I'm going to go to market. And just the fact of going to market, I'm going to get some assurances that I'm going to get a fair rate. And what what I really took out from your presentation today is, well, you can do that, but you're actually not really understanding your costs and how to influence those costs and manage those risks as well. We have a statement from one of the attendees as you sort of spoke to some of the examples of cost drivers that organizations should really seek to understand. Could also include transportation costs. What is the impact of war? What's the solvency, inflation? What's the cost of holding inventory and natural disasters as well? All of which says, actually, it's quite complicated to understand all of this. But maybe one last question before we go to break then, Larry. Based on your experience in going out there and working with various procurement organizations on this, this is something that we teach and we work with organizations when they try to adopt category management. Why are procurement organizations still not adopting this type of approach, and how can we overcome that?
Well, I think one of them is simply being awareness of developing a weighted price index model is part of it. Now that people online know there's an index model out there, this is how you build it. I go into so many organizations, Alan, and it sounds so complicated to do. It's not. And work with your IT people, your end users, your finance department, and construct these things. When we set it up for a very large organization, the first time, it took us 3 months. After that, less than 1 hour a month to manage it year over year, completely changed the way we do business. I went into a private sector pulp and paper company a couple of years ago. As a consultant, you can't promise anything, but I said, listen, you change what you're doing based on this data, I'll save you $5 million a year doing this stuff. I happened to go back to them 4 years later, and I says, I know you changed it with the model, got all the data. How did it affect your business? And they said, well, we didn't save $5 million a year. We saved $20 million a year, $80 million since the last time I left them, because they had a much more objective assessment as to how well they're doing. It's embarrassing sometimes for procurement people to say, I can't keep the cost down. I've run out of answers. And the point is, you're not able to anyway. Nobody can. So be objective and use your scorecard, your golf card on yourself to say, this is it, folks. This is where we're at.
Larry, thank you so much for your presentation today and sharing your insights. Folks, we're going to move into a break time now. And because we're just a few minutes behind, we're going to actually resume at 20 minutes past the hour. Okay, so that gives us 7 minutes before we start with our next segment. So use the time to hit the restroom, grab yourself another coffee or tea or some water, and we'll resume at 20 past the hour.
Thank you.
Okay, just a quick 2-minute call before we start again. Okay. So hopefully everyone has had a chance to charge up your coffee and tea, and then you also took the opportunity to dance along with the tunes that Jigger selected. I know I took that opportunity just to warm up my body a little bit on that. Okay, our next speaker will be presenting on the topic from reactive compliance to proactive ESG diligence. Joining us from Fair Supply are Arne and Hogan. Dr. Arne Geschke. And Arne, I hope I'm pronouncing your last name correctly, in that is a co-founder and chief data officer with Fair Supply and is globally recognized as an expert in supply chain modeling and environmental economic analysis. He brings over a decade of experience developing large-scale global databases and the mathematical framework behind Fair Supply's supply chain assessment tool, which you're going to see today. His work bridges academic rigor and practical enterprise application, and he is widely regarded as a thought leader on Scope 3 emissions and supply chain risk analytics. Arne has previously worked with major multinationals, including BMW and GM. He holds a PhD in environmental impact analysis from the University of Sydney. And joining Arne is Hogan Chan. Hogan brings years of experience in implementing enterprise risk and legal technology, and he leads with data-driven insights and really works with enterprises in enabling them to simplify compliance, quantifying risks across deep supply chains, and aligning business strategy with emerging regulatory and sustainability expectations. Arne and Hogan, I'll now pass the presentation to you.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks a lot. And hi, everyone. So I arrived here yesterday. For me, it's still middle of the night from Australia. And I'm really happy to be here, really happy to give you a bit of an overview of what we do at Fair Supply and how this links in with general supply chain management from the ESG angle, but also going beyond that. So my co-founder is a lawyer. That means that there's a disclaimer that I assume that you've all read. Yeah, so Gia, am I flicking the slides or are you?
I can flick the slides right now, but I did want to quickly say to Larry, Arne has actually brought his guitar as well. So I don't know if there's a side chat for SEC to create a band, but I'm no singer. I can try, but I think all we need is a drummer across the participants.
Hogan, I know you're a bit of a dancer, so maybe you can be one of those backup dancers behind.
I don't know where you heard that from, and that's something I told in confidence. But really excited to be here. Like Alan has mentioned, we've been really helping organizations establish the resilient supply chains across a lot of the ESG risks that we're seeing with data-driven tools. And so, with no further introductions, Dr. Arne Geschke, who you'll hear from in a moment, is basically the leading expert in large-scale supply chain assessments. So he's pretty much the brain behind Fair Supply. Seeing the agenda here, Arne will be walking us through the big picture trends, right? We'll share real-world use cases from industries like retail, mining, infrastructure, and finance, highlighting those common pain points, really what's been working and really what hasn't been in those sectors. And to keep this a lot more visual, we do want to show you a quick demo of how each of these use cases have been leveraging technology platforms. So I do want to quickly set the expectation here. We're coming at this in a consultative spirit. So while Fair Supply is one solution provider in this space, today's session is really about sharing the insights and the strategies that you can take back to your organizations that we've learned. And we definitely want to keep this interactive. So please chime in with the questions or comments throughout. But I think I will let Arne kind of set the stage and just kind of give us a really quick background on what he's seeing on a global scale.
Yeah, thanks, Hogan. So, I think ESG due diligence, ESG compliance is a field where lots of different disciplines come together and where lots of different tasks come together. And I think it's really important to take a step back and just look at this entire space from a bit of a bird's eye view to see how it all fits together. Next slide, please. So, another one before. Thanks. Another one. The next one. That one. So if you've worked in ESG reporting before, then you may have worked more in a siloed approach. Maybe you were responsible for assessing the carbon exposure. Maybe you've worked in the area of forced labor. Biodiversity loss is something that we see becoming more and more important. But it's actually, when you take a step back, most ESG risks, I would probably go so far as to say, all ESG risks are supply chain risks, but not all supply chain risks are ESG risks. There's a lot more risk that sits within supply chains. So having a good understanding of your supply chains doesn't just help you in terms of reporting and the stuff that in a way you have to do. It's also important to, it's also a really powerful tool if you want to use the insight that you get from those kinds of assessments for your own benefit. And that can actually come from the ESG due diligence or from the ESG reporting angle, because if you are plugged into global supply chains, then there may not be reporting guidelines and reporting standards in the territory where you operate, but you might be a part of a supply chain of somebody who might be under more stringent guidelines or more stringent legislation, for example, in Europe, and you are required to report to that trade partner in order to be considered as a supplier. So it's becoming a very important space to understand what's happening in the supply chains from a number of angles. So what we've listed here is in a way sort of the highlights. We've got forced labor, carbon exposure, biodiversity loss, geopolitical risks, all sitting within underneath one umbrella, and it all starts with understanding the supply chains first and looking at the different effects along the supply chains later. And especially tariffs here now in North America is obviously a very, very big topic. In June, when we all met in Calgary, we did a session on tariffs to show what kinds of what can be modeled and assessed from a supply chain framework perspective. The other three topics here are probably more on the E of ESG, but in my opinion, the geopolitical risks, that is something that will become much more important as we're going through a huge change from a global policy perspective. Next one, please. Next slide, please. Whoever's driving. So, usually, I think where we come from is that ESG due diligence at first is something that is probably, it could be seen as a bit of an annoyance, because we have to invest further resources into a process that often at the end of the process only has a disclosure or maybe a statement. And what we've seen, especially during the last 10 years as carbon legislation has come online, is that there's often not the processes in place in companies to actually do this at a very quick turnaround. And so what we've seen when we work with our partners or with our customers is that they often come from a place where the especially carbon reporting often takes an entire year just to compile the actual disclosure report. And by the time the reporting time frame is up, they've only just managed to pull the numbers together, and then the next reporting season starts again, and they can't actually work on mitigating the emissions that are in their supply chains. And we want to move away from that and provide solutions, provide assistance, that the data crunching work really is just the beginning, so that the focus can be on what do we actually do about this. And that is very much linked to the title of this slide. And we're shifting very much from disclosure to due diligence. And that at the same time brings all the different disciplines together. So 5 years ago, 3 years ago, we probably still saw the responsibility for ESG reporting sitting maybe with the chief sustainability officer. We're now seeing things move more towards procurement, so that everything related to procuring goods and services, which is inevitably linked to supply chains, is moving into the same seat within companies. And that opens a whole heap of opportunities, and that moves us from disclosure to forward-looking due diligence. And you are able then to make your supply chains a lot more fail-safe, in a sense, when everything is looked at from the same seat, so to speak, in the company. Next slide, please. So, as a recovering academic, I love definitions. So, the term due diligence in itself is something that I guess could mean different things to different people. So we pulled the definition out of the CSDD framework from the EU. So the process of companies to identify and address potential and actual adverse human rights and environmental impacts in the company's own operations, their subsidiaries, and when related in their value chains, those of their business partners. I'd probably go one step further and say I wouldn't limit due diligence to human rights and environmental impacts. I think due diligence goes further also to, say, financial risks, supply chain fragility, and supply chain volatility as a whole, to so that we get a full understanding, if we work with a certain supplier, what risks are we exposing ourselves to if we move in that direction. Okay, next slide, please. So this is something that we've seen especially speed up in the last 2 or 3 years, and that is that the role of procurement is very much changing. And what we find is that procurement maybe, and this is a very simplified view, was mainly focused on securing the best price and meeting timelines for a product that is essential for the operations of the company. What we're seeing now is that there's a whole heap of other tasks that need to be fulfilled in order to support the organization's needs, and that is compliance, that is due diligence, that might be supply chain management as a whole. You might be required to maybe report your own ESG indicators to your own customers that need that for their own disclosure. So procurement's very much moving into the center of the attention here. And like I said before, 3-4 years ago, we saw that ESG reporting was often still in a separate seat, in a separate function in the company. We are seeing now that procurement is essentially taking ownership of all of these supply chain tasks. And that comes with a whole heap of new processes, new tools, new challenges that we all need to kind of work together for in order to find a good way forward into this new world. But essentially, what a forward-looking due diligence process would be is that procurement's not only just looking at getting the right goods and services at the right time for the right price, but also ensures that where these goods and services are purchased, the risks within the supply chain are understood. And the reporting that's often linked to compliance is in a way like part of that entire process, and that's how everything now is starting to like fit much more together in one consolidated role. So I'm going to hand over to Hogan, who will take you through a number of industry examples and also show you a bit about our tool.
Thanks, Arne. I think what you mentioned makes me think back to like semiconductor shortages during COVID, right? Companies that had mapped beyond tier 1 actually knew where the chips were coming from, right? They were able to move faster and secure alternatives. And we've seen that only those who discovered the issue when shipments stopped, that's when they're really reactive. And by then the damage is already done. But I think this is a great leeway, right? When Arne just talked about due diligence as resilience, we've seen this being played out in the field, right? Procurement teams who've embraced this shift are not only avoiding the fines or PR issues, they're realistically building out a much stronger supplier partnership and also unlocking efficiencies. So I'm actually really excited to kind of go through what we've been helping with and really what we've been learning within the Canadian market as well. So I was going to say next slide, but I realize I'm in control. So, so let me just go to the first one here. So again, that was a great overview of the drivers of many shifts recently. And again, my role at Fair Supply, I have the opportunity to both work with and really learn from a truly wide range of industries. And so sharing today here are cases that illustrate how different sectors might be tackling ESG due diligence. And again, really the points that the pain points that they're facing, what's working for them, and really what's not. So looking into retail, right? I want to first actually talk about what we're seeing as common challenges across industries. Retail is definitely one of them, but no matter the sector, we're hearing three common pain points. For those of you in the room right now, these might be hitting quite close to home, but the first one we want to talk about is multiple siloed data sources. Information needed for ESG reporting is scattered across different systems and departments. And so really what they're dealing with is the lack of a single source of truth. And so inherently what that means is the ownership of ESG due diligence is fragmented. We've also heard of manual processes, right? Teams that are using Excel and emails to gather supplier info and compile reports works, but it is costly, it's time consuming, and we found that it's actually inconsistent year to year, right? It lives and it, I'd say, relies on trouble knowledge. And so this manual work really drives people and professionals right off the edge because of reporting season and strategies that lack scalability. Now, the third one I want to talk about, I think it's perhaps the biggest and the obvious issue here. And it's that companies have visibility over their tier one suppliers, their direct relationships, which is a good step. But all in all, it's a little beyond where we see the risks often lie, right? In tier two, three, or beyond. And traditional supplier management that we've worked with just does not reach that far. So these pain points, I think, do manifest a bit differently in each industry. So if we look at the four today here, retail, mining, energy, as well as finance, we can really dive into how they're dealing with this in action. So the first one up, right, we're talking about retail and consumer goods. These brands are typically, especially within the Western countries, are under intense pressure to identify, to mitigate, or even in some cases, eliminate forced labor from the supply chains. Here in Canada, we've got the Supply Chains Act being enacted here, which really means companies now must produce credible, and I think the key word here is defensible risk assessments for the supply chains. And of course, report them to the government, right? Boards and consumers now are asking to see companies that are proactively checking for things like forced labor or emissions. And so what we're seeing now is that forced labor is often a hidden risk as well as crime, very deep in the supply chain beyond tier one. So when we think about consumer goods, a retailer, electronics, they might have thousands of products and components and ingredients sourced through layers of suppliers. It's daunting, and really none of those, I think, really truly show you the scale of the risk that we're dealing with. What we've seen working is that retailers are adopting tools to trace the supply chain, right, and identify these high-risk areas. Some are working closely with suppliers with questionnaires. Some are using data like indices, right, to prioritize where to audit or intervene. But I think they're also collaborating through industry initiatives like today, right, to share information about problems, about problem factories or even regions in general. So why is that not working as well? The first thing that we've seen is that relying solely on supplier self-audits or questionnaires, a lot of companies do send out these annual compliance forms, but they have limited effect. If a supplier themselves don't know what's happening at the sub-supplier level, then the cleanest assessment in the world really wouldn't mean much for any organization. So we've seen companies realize this, right? We've seen companies react to this once they had forced labor allegations after an NGO might have exposed it. But this is really putting them in a very vulnerable spot. And this is why we're seeing retailers, people in industries like consumer goods are moving towards what we're calling a more proactive risk mapping. So to give really a sense of scale globally, it's estimated that 468 billion worth of goods, right, are at risk of modern slavery. That's a huge number. We're talking about electronics, right, palm oil, solar panels, textiles. And I think those numbers really underscore how widespread the risk is and why retail chains need this careful due diligence as part of their onboarding. All right. And so for the next one, from mining and resources, we're actually going to switch gears from a forced labor lens to actually now diving into emissions, right? In mining and resource extraction, the organizations we speak with, the big ESG focus here is on carbon emissions and climate impact. So organizations that are grappling with scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions, GHG, for both up and down the value chain, we're seeing that being a huge challenge. So again, talking about the trends, investors, regulators are increasingly demanding this disclosure throughout their entire value chain and emissions and have credible plans to reduce them. So I think, for an example, we've seen and talked to an organization that mentioned that they reduced their own operational emissions by 5%. That's really not enough in the current day. You're expected to also report on the much larger emissions from processing the minerals you sell and from end users as well. So we don't even have to zoom out. I think the challenge here is enormous. Most of a mining organization's emission does sit outside its direct operations, right? Often downstream or processing or even product use. So I think right now with mining, they do require new methodologies or even close collaboration with suppliers. And so what's been working for them, again, is engaging the suppliers. They've been introducing programs to adhere to frameworks. They're investing in better data tools. And for example, using industry frameworks to estimate emissions where direct data isn't available, again, is part of the technology that we offer. So we've seen a few miners partner with downstream customers to develop cleaner processes, which is great. It helps reduce the scope 3 footprint for both parties. But again, going back to risk modeling, companies are also using these tools to estimate when situations and suppliers don't provide that data. So instead of being in a blind spot, they suddenly have a ballpark figure or a directional impetus on where to actually prioritize their resources. So the challenge, right? A lot of companies still struggle with data collection, getting consistent, high quality emissions data from pretty much every supplier is a huge undertaking. Some rely on industry averages, right? And so that might not reflect a specific supply chain. But I think overall, for many organizations, the silo between sustainability as well as procurement team is a huge issue. Construction and infrastructure. I think this one ties quite closely to mining. And so what we've seen here is that construction and infrastructure organizations often deal with massive supplier networks, thousands upon thousands of suppliers, think from huge equipment manufacturers, really down to the smaller subcontractors. And so the ESG challenge here is managing such a broad supplier base with varying levels of ESG maturity. And so I think for procurement teams, it's not a realistic or pragmatic goal to continually assess and depend on every single supplier for ESG risks. It's just impossible. If you're doing that today, hats off to you. But it really is about finding those blind spots, right? Especially when many are small or even private sub-suppliers for your firm. So as a result, what we've seen and what customers have talked to us about is the risk of supplier fatigue, right? The risk of overloading your supplier base. And so too many suppliers to handle, it does lead to, I'd say, important issues slipping through the cracks. We've got a construction firm that might unknowingly source materials from a supplier that started polluting or violating labor laws, but simply because they've never had the bandwidth to check or reassess that supplier, they've managed to create that risk for themselves. So I think in those situations, it's a huge undertaking to adopt an approach where you essentially are required to run before you know how to crawl. So we've seen that a lot of organizations are really adopting more of a triage approach, for lack of a better word, to supply due diligence. So what we've seen, especially within the construction sector, is segmenting suppliers by risk through categories, maybe based off origin, by commodity, past incidents, maybe certifications. That's really the big prerogative dependent on the organizations we speak with. So why hasn't the traditional approach been working? I call that the shotgun approach, right? You're just slapping these questionnaires and see what comes back. It's really ineffective, right? It overloads the suppliers and it overloads the procurement staff who then have to chase and review thousands of responses. So I think right now with construction, the pitfall is, in my opinion, and you guys can prove me wrong and say otherwise, is that there's a huge focus on tier one and that assumptions that subcontractors will manage their subs. And that doesn't often happen. Without deeper visibility, I think the companies do end up exposed. And so the key lesson that we've learned here for infrastructure in particular is that deep supply chain visibility is a requirement to manage risk at scale. And that could mean leveraging technology, additional headcount, or again, taking an entire look at the assessment or the actual due diligence part within the procurement framework. And the last one here for finance, it's quite an interesting one. It's best to switch perspective from a procurement professional to maybe an investor. I don't know, who's in the professional space within finance here today, but again, we speak with pension funds, capital market teams, banks, and asset managers. And while these organizations might not manage that physical supply chain of goods, they have a supply chain of investments, right? Companies they've invested in, and those companies have supply chains. So what we've seen is that investors actually now have begun to need defensible insight on ESG risks across diverse portfolios. The trend that we see is that investors aren't really comfortable taking a look at sustainability reports at face value anymore. I think as Arne mentioned, a lot of investors do view ESG management maybe as a sign of broader governance problems. So if a company in the portfolio isn't managing its supply chain risks, investors want to know. And that's what we've seen within the financial markets as well. So the companies in a portfolio all disclose ESG information, but the pain points are, again, common throughout these industries. It's very difficult for these analyst teams or these firms to get comparable and actual apples to apples comparison of ESG risk data. And so what we've seen is one company might report a low carbon footprint because they excluded scope 3 or have incomplete data, whereas another might look high in the emissions just because they're thorough. And so investors could be misled, right? Funds with green mandates might be inappropriately looking or managing the money if they don't dig deeper. So I think, again, trusting companies' sustainability report is one way, but those, again, could be uneven and very qualitative. And so the key thing that we're able to do and help with investors or supply chain professionals, again, goes down to our ability to quantify the risks without a heavy lift. So just to kind of sum up here, I think, Alan, I see your face popped up. How am I doing on time?
You're doing really, really great on time. I only pop up because I've got a few follow-up questions for you as well, actually. And actually, at this point in time, I invite our audience to also punch any questions that you have into the Q&A box for Arne and Hogan. please do continue, and I've got a few follow-up questions for you.
Perfect. Thanks, Alan. But just kind of following that thought, right? I think across these examples, retail, mining, energy, finance, those common patterns are very evident for us, right? Organizations are trying to get ahead of these risks instead of reacting after the fact. So some are finding success by using data, by using technology. Some are still going through the status quo, right? And if it works, that's fine. But I think that is a huge risk that could be easily mitigated with a equalizer like technology providers or risk layers like fair supply. So with that said, I think I actually want to show you really briefly how these organizations have been using it. But
Hey, Arne,
before that, I
hey,
know
Hogan,
Alan had
before
those
you jump there,
questions.
yeah, I was just ask a few questions, and there was something that Arne said at the beginning that that really struck with me here, and Arne, you said all ESG risks are supply chain risks,
Yep.
and not all supply chain risks are ESG risks.
Yeah.
And
Sorry. Yeah.
and that's big because I reflect back on my sustainability journey. Certainly, very early on in my sustainability journey, when we were looking at sustainable supply chain, we sort of we looked at sustainability as that mosquito, that annoyance. Oh my gosh, here's that group from sustainability coming to us again,
Yep.
bothering us, making sure that we have to fill out these forms and ask these questions and so on and so forth. And what the reason why that really stuck up to me really, really well was that ESG risks are actually supply chain risks. And it says a lot. And I reflect back to when Canada's forced labor legislation came into effect. And what that created was this moment in which supply chain organizations stopped and paused and says, "Oh my goodness, I actually don't have visibility in my supply chain." Not even tier 2, tier 3, like even at the tier 1 level, most organizations that we spoke to did not have that level of visibility. And so if you didn't have visibility to forced labor legislation in your supply chain, what else don't you have visibility to?
Yep.
And that created a moment of like, oh my goodness, like, have we really improved since the pandemic to really, really understand the risks in our supply chain? Maybe I'll pass it back to the two of you to maybe comment on that and share some stories around that.
So like heaps of stories, right? So I guess the first story that we've all experienced is that we all went through toilet paper shortages during COVID, because somewhere along the line a lockdown shut down a certain industry, and then certain commodities had like just one or two inputs in their supply chain that were suddenly not available, and an entire industry stopped or was hugely reduced. So I guess for our customers, because we started off working in modern slavery, forced labor from the beginning, what we found is that forced labor and sort of working conditions that are not very agreeable often sort of erupt locally. There was like several years ago, there was this collapse of a garment factory in Bangladesh. And then those are often isolated events that erupt where people where there's a lot of focus on a specific incident that was reported. But there are, I think, more than 40 million people in forced labor conditions these days around the planet. And so these effects, or these you could say these risk exposure touches supply chains in tens of thousands of instances. And like you said, Alan, often companies already struggle to keep a good overview of what's happening in tier 1. We work with big construction companies, especially in Australia, and they sometimes have in excess of 25,000 suppliers. Keeping an overview of what these suppliers doing is already a challenge. What's happening beyond that, so tier 2, tier 3, all the way down to tier 10, which is probably where most of the forced labor happens. It would be the same for Canada, because Canada as a country is obviously not a very high-risk country for forced labor, but we are linked to more high-risk regions through global supply chains, and that's where our customers are often very grateful when we can give data solutions that help that help, like looking beyond tier one and identifying those kinds of risks and also pointing in the right direction what to do about it. And so, as one anecdote would be, for example, that we worked with a infrastructure company and said, like, oh, in your supply chains there is one supplier for was actually, I think, rolling stock for railways that is linked to forced labor in Asia, and you might want to run more due diligence on that if that is somehow managed. And that actually then erupted, I think, 6 or 8 weeks later in the press in Australia, that was then suddenly identified. And so we were able to sort of put the spotlight on that beforehand, and certain management or mitigation measures could be taken before that became a big problem.
Absolutely. Hogan, did you want to anything else to add to what Arne just shared?
I think it kind of goes hand in hand. I'm just looking over the Q&A right now. I think we've been asked around how we approach ESG questions for organizations that might not necessarily need to disclose that information. And I think, and where we come in as a technology provider is let's remove that equation entirely, and let's not depend on the crafting of the questions, right? What we're able to do is actually surface those data points for these small businesses without needing to engage them. So one, you're making their lives easier, you're making your own lives easier as an organization, and you're actually building in a quantifiable due diligence process. So I don't know if that answers the question, adds any more context to Arne's answers, but I think, just to answer that first question, we're really just trying to remove that headache entirely from these issues.
That's great. And I think through the demonstration next, I think you're going to be able to answer that question that was posed in the Q&A as well. And then the other one I thought was that what really stuck out to me really well was that your next slide around scope 3 emissions, and again, it's one of those things where I think the first gut reaction from the procurement community is, oh my gosh, here's another thing that we have to assess and report on, and I always sort of encourage our community to turn that around and say, well, rather than seeing this as that mosquito, how do we turn this around and see this as truly an opportunity? And I really appreciate when you went into it, Hogan, and you said, hey, by just looking at this, you're actually questioning the efficiency of your supply base. And through that discourse and collaboration with your supply chain and having the conversation around emissions, you're actually talking about cost drivers, right? Back to what Larry was saying, understanding cost driver and energy usage is a cost driver, carbon intensity and emissions is a cost driver, and you're actually working to minimize that significant risk and cost into your supply base as well.
Exactly. And I'm actually quite excited to kind of go into it now. Personally, I am a visual learner myself. Hopefully everyone else here is. But again, just to kind of preface throughout this demonstration, I'm really going to put myself in the shoes as a procurement professional who needs to assess ESG risks among suppliers, right? So when we go through this entire exercise, think of this as that either frontline due diligence check or the kind of analysis that you might want to do for a quick health check on your existing supply network. So bear with me here. Let me just try, I can share the screen, or let me try and send the request here. Wouldn't be a Monday without technical hiccups. Bear with me here. I think I've just sent over a share request here. Don't know if you guys got it over on your end.
Jigger, have you seen that share request come through on your end?
There we go.
Proved it.
Perfect. Great. And Arne, you can be my tech guy. Do we see the live assessment on the screen?
We do.
Okay, great. You guys don't have my Slack and everything. That's awesome. So now that we've explored why proactive ESG due diligence is so critical, I think I'll show you how our partners have been assessing supply chain risk in real time, focusing on the two areas that we've already talked about, right? Modern slavery, forced labor, and emissions. So what you should see here on the screen is a dashboard interface. Now, typically the first step here, of course, is to feed in your data that you actually typically already have. Your suppliers, names, spend categories, which I think procurement teams already have readily, right? Think of it like uploading a simple spend report, countries, spend amounts. And I think the beauty of these tools is that they can really take that data you have and trace out the risk across your entire global supply chain. So in our case, what you're seeing here is Fair Supply using what's called an MRIO model, multi-regional input-output. I'm not going to get too technical because I know Arne is just going to laugh at me, but it's essentially a massive economic model that maps out how industries are connected globally. So what we're seeing here on my screen is that forced labor risk profile that's stood up just based off your spend amount, right? This is that summary that you need as a procurement manager coming in morning of a Monday, and now you've got a command and control of your entire risk profile. So the tool is now able to actually surface these insights for you instantly, right? And this has been super valuable for procurement managers because within seconds, they know where to prioritize or where to focus their resources. If, let's say, for an example, what we're seeing here, it's already highlighting that this industry within Pakistan is one of our biggest risks, then again, we might need to engage them for deeper due diligence, reprioritize, reconsider that relationship. I think the key part here for a lot of procurement managers is what next with this information. And this is, I think, really where we work really closely with our partners in understanding where the priorities lies. But I'm going to kind of walk the team through really quickly here. What else that they've been very dependent on within the platform is what we see here as the right-hand screen with the numbers. Now, for today, they're not important on how to contextualize it, but this is essentially what we call an intensity metric, right? It tells us on average as an organization how many potential exposures within or victims are implied for $1 million of spending, and given the industries as well as the regions we're sourcing from. So straight away, what you're seeing here is Fair Supply giving you a strategy to normalize, to quantify, and I think also to benchmark the risks and improvements over time. What we've seen so far here is that bird's eye view, right? And again, procurement teams naturally ask next, okay, we see this holistically. Now we want to understand what suppliers specifically might be driving this risk and what the heck do I do about it, right? So if we scroll down here to the supplier level details, why this is useful is that within seconds, I've got that multidimensional risk view of a supplier. Maybe I want to filter it by our spend, by the risk. But what we've seen here is that this entire view would traditionally have taken teams maybe weeks if they had to manually research and send questionnaires. So what we're showing here is a platform essentially surfacing the context, the red flags in seconds. And this means your team can actually decide very quickly, should I deepen due diligence on the supplier? Should I commission a consultant to do a third-party audit? Or if the risks are plainly too high, we need to start considering alternatives. And a lot of these features and functionalities are really going to what Arne has mentioned, is giving you proactive insights to mitigate any reactive circumstances. So the real power here is, I'd say, is breaking it down, right? Immediately, you might be able to spot that not all suppliers contribute equally to our risks. In this example, we see that the top 3 suppliers make up over probably 50% of the risk. And this is hugely important for prioritization. In our previous example with the retail goods, they are now able to actually understand how to tackle these categories, which textiles are at most at risk, and actually create a framework that they can follow that's both scalable as well as both short-term and long-term viable as well. I'm not going to go into a huge feature show and tell here, but again, within geography, sectors, our X-ray into tiers, this is really how we can show the risk distributed across tiers. And I guess I have to plug this in. If you want to see more, just message us, but I won't go through the whole spiel today here. But this is essentially how you can engage and decide to either go deeper in the supply chain by asking your tier one suppliers through our engagement tools like requesting. And again, at this point, we've done an entire workflow of a procurement professional either doing a due diligence report for a supplier, reassessment of their entire supply base for a health diagnostic, or engaging these suppliers for escalation or remediation efforts as well. So the key that I want to really like bring to the team here is visibility. And we don't want you to fly blind straight past your first tier. We want to actually give you the X-ray and diagnostics on how to do this, either in a geographical lens, industry lens, sector, tier, or even entire supply chains. So in its essence, what we've been able to do is provide all this information just using a spend information for forced labor risk exposure. What I want to do is kind of switch modules now and actually talk about the second use case around emissions module within our platform. So at the click of a button, all we have to do is click into emissions. And it does look very familiar to the previous one, but what we've got now is this exact same data set that's giving us different insights in varying levels of an ESG lens. And I think at this point here, again, I think Arne, if you want to jump in here for the scopes 1 and 2, but essentially we're able to actually adhere to the GHG protocols and condense a lot of the reporting and the due diligence efforts that you might be adhered to from, I guess, a huge effort into a few simple clicks you can do on a daily basis. So I think
maybe before
yeah.
Arne jumps in, if you can even define scope 3 emissions for some of the audience members that may not be familiar with that term.
Arne loves doing that.
Yeah, so in my opinion, scope 3 is the bucket that everything goes into that scope 1 and 2 doesn't cover. So scope 1 emissions are the emissions that are directly caused by companies, by the reporting company's operation. Scope 2 are the first set of value chain emissions, and I find them quite intuitive value chain emissions. Those are the emissions that are associated with energy, mainly with energy consumption by the reporting company. So the scope 2 emissions of this meeting would be all the emissions from the power stations that we are plugged into with our laptops. And then scope 3 are all value chain emissions that are not covered under scope 1 or scope 2. So everything from supply chains upstream down to revenue, what I call revenue chains downstream. So if you are, for example, a energy mining company, then there's like significant exposure in downstream emissions.
Thank you, Arne. I haven't had a chance to look over the comments. I don't know if there were any questions throughout, but I think we have a Q&A section after this, Alan. I'm not too sure. Great.
We do, yeah.
That's awesome. So just to finish my thought here, I'm not going to go into the numbers by numbers here, but what I want to actually call out here is that these aren't just one-time assessments, right? We can update that data quarterly, annually, depending on your ESG mandates internally, and we're happy to work with you. But we just want to illustrate that this is one method that we've seen quite cost-effective, it's scalable, and again, we're introducing quantification to things that traditionally cannot be. And I think the last piece here is going through the analyst tool. So I'm going to actually highlight the fourth use case that we talked about today within the financial realm, and really how they've been using a tool that we call Analyst to help them find those insights. So switching hats a little bit, again, beginning that perspective of a financial analyst within capital markets. But this also has a lot of overlap with a procurement professional that's doing due diligence, a vendor onboarding process, right? You can bake these processes and these features as part of that larger framework. So going back to the financial world, right? The hard question here for a lot of these guys are, do you actually know the ESG risks hidden inside the companies you invest in? And we've seen that traditional risk ratings are surface level, right? We've talked about this. I think a lot of the published sustainability reports has a certain look and feel to them that appeases investors. And again, this is a very general broad of observations that we've seen. But as a trend as well, we're seeing investors demanding harder and more defensible evidence across these investment advice or investment philosophies as well. So what are we seeing here? Well, really quickly, we've got a tool here that actually enables you and allows you to search up organizations, whether it's got subsidiaries, whether it's got operating headquarters in different organizations or, sorry, countries. But what you can easily do here is actually type in an organization, and our AI actually is able to understand if there's any subsidiaries, any other organizations, just in case that they're related or that you might be wanting to have a catch-all system for an analytical report. So for the sake of time, I've got a page prepared here, but the story to tell here is by the time you're pretty much finished your first cup of coffee, your entire due diligence work is done using a platform like this, right? It is showing you what kind of related entities it has, the annual revenue, all the information you might need from a modern slavery lens. And I think that we want to highlight that because it's traditionally been that harder evidence that a lot of investors have been asking for. On the emissions front, I think disclosures and data has been more readily available than forced labor. So I think this is particularly valuable for today and the attendees today to see as well. But basically what you're seeing now is a reportable, auditable report with sources that's able to now go through the tiers in a search before even engaging these suppliers or the organization you want to invest in, right? So you have cut down a lot of the work that may be necessary before, and now it's a nice to have or an optional part of the process. So the last thing I'm going to be talking about is kind of just wrapping up all of these themes we talked about. Before I get there, Arne, anything to add on your end?
Yeah, so the screen that Hogan's showing now, or that Hogan was showing just then, Analyst is essentially taking away the work that used to be filled out by sort of 1.5 to 2 days of desk-based auditing of a new supplier. And especially with all these new angles in terms of you have to make sure that there's no risk that you expose yourself to when you onboard a new supplier in terms of supply chain risk, in this case, forced labor. That's something that can be quite that can be very, very time and resource intensive. And so what sits behind this tool is like a whole army of AI agents that does all the work for you. And we should also say that the carbon version of this analyst tool is currently in beta and will also be will join the Fair Supply product lineup very soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Arne.
If you could scroll up a little bit, Hogan, that keep on going around the different tiers. This is pretty big, and I know when we had the S211 legislation come through, a lot of concerns from our supply chain community around how do we go about assessing modern slavery risk. And so, you know, the challenge was actually just getting a lot of the questionnaires out to tier one
Right.
suppliers and then have them assess themselves to provide you insights into tier two, tier three, and so on and so forth. And the big lesson learned that came out of it was actually our tier one suppliers. We didn't know where our tier one suppliers sat. And certainly our tier one supplier did not know where sort of the next tier sat down the value chain as well. And so then there was this aha moment around, oh my goodness, how do we actually go about doing this? Because the expectation from the business is that supply chain organization, you have to take on this accountability, but we're not going to give you any more people to do so. And so having, you know, this view here in which we're able to now see in a resource friendly way that, you know, here's the risk exposure in tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, and so on and so forth. That's a big game changer.
That's the idea, right, Alan? I think what we're really trying to do is provide a very lightweight solution to that heavyweight problem, right? And that's what we're seeing here. Very conscious of time, but if there's 3 things I just kind of want to wrap everyone's takeaways from today's session is, I think regulations and investors and the public are really driving this proactivity. practical tools and automation make it achievable and cost effective. And back to the theme of the today, really, supply chain visibility is supply chain resilience, right? And that's what we want to really say to the people here. But just, I guess, to close out, I would encourage everyone here to think about where your organization stands from a reactive to a proactive scale. And maybe you're just starting out. Maybe you have some systems in place, but I just want to say it's really about the progress and not perfection. And that's what we're trying to introduce to organizations in the Canadian market.
Wonderful. Thank you, Hogan. We've got another 7 minutes to go for Q&A. So I'm just going to list some of the questions that were posted. One individual said, you showed risk exposure can sometimes sit deep in tier 3 or tier 4. The question is, how should companies balance addressing these deep-tiered risks when they have limited influence versus engaging directly with tier 1 suppliers?
Classic problem, and everyone has the same challenge to work with. So what we sorry, I'm still a bit sick. Someone caught something on the plane over here. So what we often see is that our customers come in and run a full screen of their entire supplier base to understand which of my suppliers bears a high risk of forced labor. And then once a company, and Hogan showed it in the dashboard at the very beginning, once you identify, say, your top 10 forced labor risk suppliers, you can then dive into their tier exposure, and you have similar plots to what we just showed then. And some of the suppliers might not be aware that they actually carry a high risk of forced labor because it's actually sitting in their own supply chains. And the direct supplier themselves, the tier 1 supplier, has a very low risk of forced labor, but they might have the forced labor in their own tier 3 or tier 4. So what we can do then is there's a bunch of features in the dashboard where the supplier can be contacted directly through a self-assessment questionnaires, and we can essentially like just share that and say, hey, this is the risk that popped up. You guys are linked into supply chains that potentially have a high exposure of forced labor. Are you aware of that, and how are you dealing with it? And sometimes we get responses back where suppliers say, yes, we are aware of that, and that's why we made the decision not to source certain raw materials from certain regions. So we turn certain supply chains off, and that like reduces the risks. How far you want to go into that very much depends on the reporting company. So sometimes companies say, I only want to provide a sort of minimum work package report on forced labor in line with the legislation, and the legislation might say you just have to identify to what extent you are causing, contributing, or linked to forced labor. And so the actual knowledge of this in itself might be enough to report on forced labor. What we often see is that companies come in and work with their supply from that viewpoint, and they say, we just want to get this off my desk. It's a bit like that mosquito problem that you described before, Alan, where, oh, there's another piece of legislation we have to adhere to. There's another piece of work that's now added to our list, and they kind of want to have the minimum package. But then as they move through the journey with us, they actually become advocates for having a proactive forced labor management approach to their suppliers, so that they really do make a difference in their supply chains. And there are several success stories that we've seen over the years.
Great. Thank you, Arne. Another question from the audience. How does the time horizon, short versus long-term, affect ESG risk assessment?
That's a big question. I'm not sure if an hour would be enough to answer that. So if you think about, say, maybe pathways towards net zero, if you want to sketch out a pathway where maybe a company goes towards net zero by 2050, that's of course a huge piece of work. And you might be able to set a base year for 2020 or 2025, and then work from that year and reduce your emissions by a number of % per year, with the goal to reducing the overall exposure to net zero by 2050. But while you're doing that, the supply chains and the global economy around you is changing. So some countries might crank up their renewables, their renewable production, so the overall emissions intensity of the economy goes down. which then changes the landscape, because what looked like the logical path forward in 2025 might not be the logical path forward in 2030 anymore, because there might be regions in the world that are a bit more ahead when it comes to decarbonization of energy networks. And it might make more sense on a net zero pathway to switch suppliers so you can plug more into those kinds of supply chains in those regions where others do the work for you. And then you can also have the other situation, which I guess we see south of the Canadian border at the moment, is where the effort's rolling back a little bit in terms of going into a lower carbon future. So it's again, I would say it is again kind of a question of sort of attitude and goals within each individual company. Some companies just want to report on emissions or ESG in general and don't want to worry about it any further. And what we see is many companies start at that point and then they really move into, we want to proactively manage our ESG exposure so that we can use this to our own advantage as well. And in that case, the time horizon is always important.
Great. Another question is, many of our members and folks in the audience today have a really hard time in managing the trade-offs between sustainability action and many of the traditional financial performance expectations from the business. So how do supply chain organizations or organization in general balance this, and how do you balance long-term resilience with short-term procurement pressures?
I think, again, that's a question that has like a million answers to it. And it depends on the industry that you're in. It depends on the mandate you have internally. It depends on who are your buyers, who are your sellers, where do you procure your stuff, where do you sell your stuff. So, for example, if you think about CSDDD in Europe, if you want to have a competitive advantage for being a supplier in Europe, it's good to get the ESG muscle trained early on, because then you have all the information that you need to be an attractive supplier to be considered in Europe. So being a best-in-class leader in ESG in that case will actually unlock markets quicker than it might for your competitors. So in that sense, it doesn't always have to, financial performance and ESG performance don't always have to work against one another. And I think that's kind of what I would like to see this entire discipline move towards, is that we understand that having a great ESG performance actually works in our favor financially as well, so that sustainable companies are also successful companies. And that's where this proactive component comes to, because if you just do ESG reporting, you're always looking retrospectively at your business in the last 12 months, and then you assess what's your exposure, and then you move on to the next one. Whereas what I want to do is I want to make decisions. I want to go into this market, and I want to understand, if I sell into this market, what is my what do I need to do in terms of ESG management in order to be an attractive player in that market. Or maybe not so much now, but maybe 5 years ago, the question around, will there be carbon taxes? There's border adjustments and all those kinds of things. In order to be competitive in that new landscape, it is important to understand, how do your suppliers track? Are your suppliers carbon intensive? Does it make sense to maybe change suppliers, change to a supplier that might be a little bit more expensive, but is like a lot more carbon efficient, because that gives you a huge advantage when it comes to border adjustment mechanisms, because you can prove that your supply chains are actually a lot leaner when it comes to carbon exposure. Those kinds of factors are starting to sort of, I think we're moving into that space now. It's not fully developed yet.
Brilliant, and I think with our ongoing relationship with Fair Supply as well, you guys are going to be coming back and presenting via webinar and other formats to really dive into this, to really share your thought leadership in this space as well. So we're looking forward to that. Arne and Hogan, thank you so much for the insights that you've shared. Really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having us, and the great questions. So hope everyone found something valuable today and some useful insight they can take back to their team. But last thing is, if you want to learn a little bit more, there's a QR code on the slides here. So we're happy to chat with anyone. Feel free to ask any questions as well.
Fantastic. Thank you,
Thanks.
gentlemen. Okay, we'll go to the next segment. So I'm really excited here to have Scott and Andrew join us on the next topic. Scott and Andrew have extensive experience on large construction and infrastructure projects. They've worked with clients to plan, develop, and negotiate contractual documentation for major projects in a variety of industries, including mining, oil and gas, energy, civil, and public infrastructure, green power generation and transmission, as well as carbon capture and sequestration as well. MLT has been a consistent thought leader for Supply Chain Canada in this space, and I'm really excited to have Scott and Andrew speak to the topic of planning and drafting contracts in an era of uncertainty. Gentlemen, I'll pass the presentation to you.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you. Sounds like we're working.
There we go. Perfect.
There we go.
Well, thanks everybody for taking the time, and thanks again, Alan, for the kind words and the kind introduction. The key over the past number of years, we've seen a significant amount of uncertainty, and we're going to talk a little bit about where this has come from, and what we are seeing is that this is more often than not changing how we're approaching contracts and making it difficult to rely on the existing contracting strategies that people have relied on for quite some time. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what are the sources of this uncertainty that are impacting contracting strategies. What are the key contract considerations that are needed to address and manage this uncertainty? And lastly, we're going to wrap it up with some of the differing approaches between the private and public sector organizations. Andrew?
Oh, sorry, I think we, thanks, Scott. Oh. So I mean, it's a changing landscape, and I think we've seen that just about everywhere, and you didn't need us to tell you that, certainly not in 2025. It feels like we've been living in an era of change for, well, at least half a decade now, I'd say, but perhaps longer, depending on your point of view. And so there's, the hottest topic, which Scott and I think, we've done a previous Supply Chain Canada presentation on this, on tariff and trade disruption specifically. And that's probably the hottest topic right now. But there's a lot of other areas that have brought uncertainty in here for contracting parties and procurement professionals. And one is legislative changes. We'll talk a little bit about prompt payment quickly. Another, of course, is inflation. Project costs are going up, but the budgets are not necessary. The changes in budgets are not necessarily meeting the changes in pricing due to inflationary pressures, especially on longer projects that have multi-year kind of from plan to action cycles that inflation is needs to be accounted for there. Another one is the size, the scale, and the complexity and volume of projects. And just reflecting on this presentation, I'm from Winnipeg, and so over the weekend, beautiful fall day, we went out to the old kind of site of one of the first hydroelectric dams in Manitoba, and it's decommissioned now, and it was built for $3 million in 1906, which sounds like not a lot, but if you bring that to today's dollars, it's about 83 million. But it only, it's a pretty small project. You can kind of walk right across it. You can see it. It all fits in one kind of camera frame, and it only delivered 14 megawatts of power, which at the time was a groundbreaking project in 1906. And I compare that, talking, especially it being, BC, the focus here being on BC procurement and supply chain professionals. Site C, which was, comes in as a $16 billion project with 1,100 megawatts. So, like orders of magnitude difference. So in 120 years, we've just, the change in the size and the scale of, a big hydroelectric project for the time is just increased, multiples fold. So I think that's just an example of why contracts are becoming more difficult, because you still do have, smaller projects, but then at the other end of the scale, there's these ever increasing scope and complexity of the mega projects.
And then, of course, another issue on any project, but particularly when you're trying to build really big things, is the tight labor market and getting the properly skilled workforce in the right place to build your project. And then solvency concerns in the supply chain. And it's interesting kind of jumping in here after a couple other speakers and talking about different supply chain pressures and looking into your supply chain. And one of the big issues now is solvency. And it's in many parts of a booming time, but margins are thin for at many different levels in the supply chain. And so even when things seem to be going well and projects are going well, it doesn't mean that solvency isn't a concern. And I've seen that in my own practice and a lot of projects and clients that have had other companies that are in their supply chain hit solvency issues, and that's really had a pretty dramatic impact on the projects where that happened. And then the last one is in an increasingly digital age and a technological age, that there's a lot of proprietary technology out there these days that are being used and implemented on projects, and issues of confidentiality and use of that technology are really have again added another layer of complexity that is on, we always had complicated build projects that were really pushing the envelope of what could be done in the built environment. But then now you're layering on a whole another set of technology contracting on top of your kind of major construction contracting. So that's become a really interesting and really challenging topic, I know, for many. Scott, I'll tee you up to say, taking all those things together, what does that mean?
Well, and I guess just before we do that, just one point that comes to mind, particularly on the solvency, on the solvency issues. This has been something that's been kind of driven home, over the past 6 months or so, with kind of increasing frequency. And what's become apparent is that a lot of organizations are conducting significant financial due diligence for new vendors, and that's not where we're finding our clients become surprised. It is often comes up in terms of exposure, exposure through existing relationships, and sometimes long-standing existing relationships. And also, where we've particularly been caught by surprise is where it's actually not the Canadian entity, or specifically the entity that you're dealing with, that is having financial problems, but it's often a foreign affiliate or a foreign corporate parent that runs into trouble, and that the organizational due diligence is not necessarily capturing it's not necessarily capturing the financial trouble that's happening through some European corporate parent. And so due diligence is important, and considering your security position is also important. So without further ado, what does this mean? And I think overall, the contractors and vendors are less willing to accept risk. They're paying more attention to contracts, and I think the other thing is where people are not where they're not pushing back, and where you're not getting that careful review of your contract terms. It's often from vendors that haven't read and understood the contract terms. And in those cases, sure, you are successful in negotiating more aggressive terms than you might otherwise be able to, but you have a circumstance where the contract doesn't actually reflect the meeting of the minds, and it doesn't reflect the actual business deal as the parties kind of understood it, as opposed to what's written in paper. And it's not an accurate reflection. It's not an appropriate tool to kind of manage that relationship. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second here. I think the other thing that we're seeing with increasing frequency is this level of uncertainty and this careful review of these contract terms is dragging out contract negotiations. It's making it harder to negotiate contracts. Contracts are taking longer. And so what does this mean? We see a lot of contracts that we're seeing. Owner clients and procuring entities are naturally inclined to kind of swing for the fences, so to speak. Start off with very aggressive, generic initial terms, and then negotiate down, and then negotiate back from there. I think my contention is that that's fine and that's a reasonable business decision to make, but it comes with a cost. It comes there is a cost to swinging for the fences, and it comes in terms of time. And what often happens is where you have a contract that is aggressive, or it doesn't accurately deal with the uncertainty that exists in the market and as it relates to your kind of procurement, to that particular procurement, is there's a lot of time being spent on battling back and forth over terms that more often than not, the owner really doesn't have any expectation that the parties will actually end up agreeing to. The other thing we're seeing is that there's less competition in the market. The number of procurements that we see on a daily and weekly basis where our clients have run a long and well thought out process that then at the end you end up with a single bidder or or a small handful of bidders and not generating the kind of the competitive tension that you want is pretty significant. I think, and the last 2 points are particularly important. What we're seeing is this uncertainty. It's causing projects to get delayed. It's causing delays in the approval. It's causing delays in the approval process, sometimes in terms of years. And so when a procurement strategy is developed, building in some idea of how you're going to handle the risk in in sanctioning your projects or any kind of internal approvals is quite important. I think the last thing I'll talk to on this particular point is a focus on project governance. When I started, contracts were generally procured almost entirely on a lump sum basis, and the contracts between procurement X and procurement Y, although they varied, were a lot more common. When you have differing models and very heavily negotiated contracts, explaining the risk allocation to your corporate, to your entity, to your leaders, to your board of directors, depending on who you're dealing with, is becoming more and more of a chore in and of itself. As the contracts become more complicated, the risk becomes more complicated, the risk allocation becomes more complicated. And I find in a lot of circumstances on major procurements, we spend as much time trying to help our clients explain the risk allocation to their board of directors and to their senior leaders as we do actually negotiating these contracts with our counterparties.
And just jumping in there, Scott, I think all of these things speak to the fact that that the processes themselves are starting to really take a lot. Once you stack all these things together to deal with all these risks and changes, you're starting to look at processes that are just going to get long. If you want to work out all those things in a way that's satisfactory to the organization, they're just going to take longer. And I know no one ever wants to hear that on their project, but or as part of their procurement. But I think it's something like it's a reality, and that's where the governance decision has to be made as to how much time and effort is going to be put into that.
And not to belabor the point about Canadian and US tariffs, but I just thought this is an interesting example from a couple of the presentations that we've done over the course of the past 6 months or so. When we started talking about this, the main focus was US tariffs and the impact of Canadian retaliatory tariffs. And now, as we talk to our clients kind of across Western Canada, one of the major shift in the past number of months has been the impact and the very significant impact of these Chinese tariffs. And this could all change again if something happened to the exemption for CUSMA compliant, for compliant goods. And so I just include this. We won't go through this in any level of detail, but just include this more from just a reminder in terms of when you're preparing your contracts and you're planning your contracts, you need to solve for, what may or may not happen in the future, and not excessively perseverate over kind of solving last week's risks, so to speak. And Andrew, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Yeah, so this is another one in particularly relevant in BC because we've also made over the years many prompt payment presentations as it's kind of moved through the different jurisdictions where we work in. And the biggest, BC is almost at this point the lone holdout them, and I believe I made some of the Atlantic Canadian provinces, but prompt payment is, in the construction industry has been sweeping through slowly but steadily, I'd say. And it's really, the latest reports, BC's kind of had a stop-start process, which was the story in Manitoba as well. And then, eventually political will took it across the line there. And so I think, what I've kind of most recent that I've said is that this fall, the BC government might be introducing prompt payment legislation, but whether that actually happens will remain to be seen. And if others are, more up to speed than I am, welcome to hear that. But the biggest change for buyers is that there's a tight timeline, and this is specific to construction, but tight timeline for the owner team, the buyer team to review and approve the invoices. It changes the leverage of using payment as kind of the fix-all and the cure-all for when there's issues with someone in the supply chain. And then it makes contract security more important and the contracts themselves more important because, again, the owner and buyer side doesn't have as much the cash is king leverage. Prompt payment generally, and without turning this into that presentation, flips that leverage on its head a little bit and has pretty defined timelines and dispute resolution mechanisms to deal with any payment issues. And so I think that's, for supply chain professionals in British Columbia who touch the construction industry, this is one to keep an eye out for. And it's, province to province has kind of come through. And I think at this point, it's probably not a question of if, it's, I'd say likely a question of when.
Yeah, this is a pretty big item when it sort of hit Alberta as well, and so certainly had the same issues as sort of went through from province to province, and because of the significant impact to those in British Columbia, we'd look to probably have a webinar on this topic and maybe take some of the lessons learned from the application of this in other jurisdiction, and how can BC organizations learn from that and be ready for it as well.
We'd be happy to be there, Alan, because we've been given a presentation on prompt payment for five years now. We've been presenting on it, and it's definitely a huge topic of discussion, and we don't do it justice here. But I know that it's something to keep in mind as we're grappling with these changes, and the lessons learned on the importance of contracts are definitely there, and that's where it ties to today's discussion.
Wonderful. So thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, no problem.
Just a note too, I think your sleeve must be rubbing against your microphone a bit, so just be conscious of that. Perfect. I'll pass it over to you again.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks, Andrew. So now that we've kind of gone on and kind of articulated the problem, what do you do about it? So I like to think of a contract that is intended to tell the story of how the parties are, what to tell the story of what is your commercial deal, but also how is the risk going to get managed for this particular project. Often what we see is clients going through their developing their own risk register, developing their own risk program, and then slapping on an off-the-shelf contract that has not been updated for some time onto that. And what I would encourage, and and you can't do this for each individual contract, there's just not enough time, but you can do this on kind of what I'll call like a class by class basis by looking at what you're buying, what services you're buying, what goods you're buying, what are the specific risks associated with that procurement or that group of procurements, and then identifying those risks where you expect the contract to be a key mitigating strategy. So tying it back into your risk program, how is the contract going to manage that, that particular risk? Because I think then that what's important about that is you understand going into these negotiations what's important, what aspects of this contract do we actually need in order to manage the risks for this particular project, and also what's not important, because a lot of times we see clients, and we've been in circumstances where we spend 3 weeks negotiating a clause with somebody, and then when you back up and you actually look at the project, you realize, well, this actually doesn't, it's nice to have this, it's nice to have this additional protection, but it's not actually that important to this particular project, whereas it might be more important to something else. So understanding what's important and why it matters. The next thing is review your templates. Make sure you have the right templates. Make sure they're up to date. We see clients with templates that are often 10 plus years old. Make sure your team is able to select the right template. What are you starting with? It's really hard to fix a circumstance where somebody's picked up the wrong document. Or make sure that your templates are right sized for the types of procurements and the types of services that you're buying. Make sure you have the right delivery model. Make sure that your procuring strategy is up to date and addresses the risks and uncertainty that we've in the current market, and we've talked about that before. And again, where possible, conduct a proper procurement options analysis for your major projects. And I think what's important, a lot of organizations are doing this already, but I think what's important is making sure your supply chain groups in particular are actively involved in that process. And we would suggest your legal groups as well, and it's making sure everybody understands what risks we're trying to manage, what are we trying to do with this contract, and make sure the contract is an accurate reflection of the goals that we're trying to achieve.
Yeah,
Andrew?
and yeah, totally. And just to close that point, I think the biggest thing with procurement options analysis we've seen is, don't get too focused on what people are calling things, because there's often, you can call it whatever you want. Be focused on what the outcomes you're trying to drive and how your contract's about to drive that outcome, rather than having a contract that says, has whatever magic words the procurement option analysis says it should have. Make sure it's actually got those that key. There's a dozen key terms that kind of are the hallmark of any particular contract model or procurement model, and you need to make sure you hit those. And on that point, and part of today's discussion is a comparison of where the public sector and the private sector come down on these different issues. And so we've got a bit of a comparison here. I know there's people on this call from both, and so public sector, I wouldn't say this isn't a comparison to say that they're total opposites of each other, but public sector, you've definitely got the trade agreements in the background to follow if you're under the purview of one or more of the agreements. You have to follow them. Typically, there's also behind that, in addition to the trade agreements or in conjunction with the trade agreements, requirements for an open procurement process. And there's also ways to get freedom of information requests that can really dig into what was done in the procurement process. Disaffected proponents have a lot of ways to pursue different remedies or different inquiries of lines of requesting information to really see what went on. There's often unique governance constraints, and that's, it's not always, there's different stakeholders, and the governance structure of, government procurement or municipal procurement are often reliant on multiple levels. And, it's kind of the 3 points at the bottom could kind of blend into one. But the big one for, there's often a procuring entity that's, separate or the same as the actual the entity that'll operate the asset or the goods once they're kind of procured. Then if you're in local government, you obviously know that there's financing considerations, particularly where you're reliant on other governments, kicking in a large part of the project costs. And I've seen this a number of times with municipal clients, that they get stuck and befuddled when, they start a long process to get the money for the new thing they want to build, and it's a 5-year process, and they are working off of a $20 million budget back in 2020. Well, the reality is, once that project finally gets fully sanctioned and approved by all the levels and everyone's set their commitments, then the project comes in at a $25 million project, and all of a sudden everyone's scrambling to find this last 5 million, which the municipality, unless you're a large city, typically can't come up with. And so it just becomes another layer of complexity when doing procurement in that sector. And then additional stakeholders. You have there's a lot of moving parts to most public sector entities. And so the different stakeholders that have input can really delay and frustrate procurement sometimes, but also are huge enablers in terms of getting the right services or goods. Now, private sector, is it all the reverse of that? A little bit yes, a little bit no. You have greater flexibility because there are trade agreements. You can consistently use the same vendors without having to reopen every time to an open process. You might have internal constraints on that, but if you find someone you like what they're doing, you usually have more flexibility to consistently use them and procure from them. However, there's greater impacts of macroeconomic challenges, because in the public sector, if a hospital needs to be built in a city, a hospital eventually needs to be built. It might take longer than everyone wants it to take, but it will happen. Whereas if you're looking at a mining project or some sort of development project, or oil being another example, if the economic headwinds change, or there becomes headwinds, and all of a sudden the price of whatever was going to be extracted is gone down, well, then that whole project might get canceled. So that's a macroeconomic change that might be well outside the control of anyone on the project team. And the project economics drive those governance decisions, as Scott was alluding to earlier. And then on stakeholders and shareholders, I don't think public sector has a defined set of stakeholders, and private sector is no different. They're just different. And you've got multinational stakeholders who maybe don't always understand or appreciate the local context. You've got shareholders who are perhaps not looking at the same type of thing that you might need to look at, from a local procurement lens. And so I wouldn't say one is easier than the other. They're just different, and anyone who has done any purchasing on either side in both knows that there's differences, and I don't know if anyone would say one is easier than the other. I think that kind of concludes the points we wanted to make, and I don't know if we have time for questions. If we do, we're happy to take a few, but it was really a pleasure to present here for everyone, and give you kind of a short snapshot in a kind of long day on procurement.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Scott and Andrew. And unfortunately, we don't have time to take any questions, but should you have questions for Scott and Andrew, feel free to reach out to them directly or send your questions to us, and we're happy to share them with both Andrew and Scott, and seek a response in which we can share with everyone else as well. Really appreciate the presentation, gentlemen. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Alan.
Thank you, Alan.
Okay, all right. We're down to the final stretch here, folks. Okay, as a special treat, I'm really delighted to welcome our last speaker, Dr. Jill Birch. Jill is a leadership advisor, an accomplished speaker, researcher, and author whose mission is to help organizations drive competitive advantage where vision meets action, leadership intersects strategy, and change drives results. Let me just move our presentation here to progress to this. Okay, perfect. And as CEO and member of several C-suites, Jill has provided leadership in business development, partnership development, government relations, and fundraising. She's had provided leadership consulting services to many industry sectors, and I'm really pleased to share that she's been working closely with us in the development and rollout of supply chain leadership training as well. So really excited to talk about that towards the end of your presentation, Jill. So on a topic that is truly relevant to all of us today, please welcome Jill to speak on the topic, From Complexity to Clarity, 3 practices supply chain leaders can use today. Jill.
Thanks, Alan. And am I driving today or?
You are. So you've got control, and at the very bottom left-hand corner of the screen, you'll see
Oh,
a
I
little
see. I
icon
see.
there that you can
Jigger is
progress the
giving me
slides.
the keys to the car. That's a very dangerous thing. Thanks so much. It's great to be with everybody. I know you've had a great session. I've been listening in this morning and really enjoyed hearing the leaders speak to you about all of the issues. And today I want to focus on things that I think are important for the shifts that all of the speeches that you've heard so far have been covering. And if I picked up anything, it was that this is a great time of change. It's a great time of rethinking things. It's how we approach things. And so what I'm going to be chatting with you today is about how to think about and reformat and reimagine the kind of leadership that you think is required in this hustle bustle 24/7 very disruptive world that we're living in right now. And I want to start my presentation off by talking to you about Keith. And this is an interesting story that I think, belays a lot of the challenges that I certainly see in leadership as I work with people and companies and teams across North America. And Keith was the youngest chief marketing officer at Deloitte ever. In fact, he was the youngest chief marketing officer in any of the Fortune 500 companies in North America at the time. And you can imagine, I mean, he was incredibly well schooled. He went to the finest institutions. He had great internships, and all of that very, very quickly accelerated him up the path to become the leader of Deloitte's marketing efforts across North America. So, he was doing well at his job. He was getting lots of accolades. People were supportive of him. And then, as time went on, what happened is Keith began to feel this resistance from his team. And you know what it's like if any of you have been at a cocktail party and maybe there's someone who approaches you and you're like, oh gosh, do we really have to talk to so and so? Let's all just scatter off into the corners. And that's what was happening to Keith. He just didn't understand what was going on. And so he was proactive. He decided to hire an executive coach. And he began to, invite her in. And of course, the first meeting, she lands up at his office, which is the size of the Vatican, because he's, so up the food chain and all of that. And he says, Nancy, her name was Nancy Bedore, what do I have to do to become a great leader? What's going wrong here? Like, I've been doing so well. And Nancy paused and she looked around his office and she said to him, why are there only pictures of you on the wall? Where are the pictures of your team? The people that you're supposed to be igniting and empowering and really helping them move forward. Like, where is that? And as he looked around the room, yes, it was Keith accepting an award, his hand, being shaken by the CEO, Keith at a podium, Keith at a gala, nothing of his team. And this really underscores the big sea changes that we're seeing in leadership, that you can have the greatest technical and professional expertise in the world, and you can still fail. And so what I want to talk to you today about is how we can think about different ways to lead. And I know all of you in the audience are incredibly gifted, talented leaders already. I also know that you've got great credentials, digital badges, PDUs from Supply Chain Canada. And I want to talk about adding to your pixie sauce here, your pixie dust. I want to talk to you about what are the things that you can do to make a difference. And so one of the things that I certainly see as I work with leaders that are emerging, so whether you're sort of a new manager, a seasoned manager, a director, you know, as associate director, heading toward, you know, being a VP or a VP, there is this moment of emergence in all of these forms of leadership, isn't there? When you kind of become a team member and you're maybe leading a team for the first time, or maybe it's the 20th time, but you're trying to make your mark. And I call this the double bind of leadership. And it really speaks to this challenge we have where you're trying to fit in, and at the same time, you're trying to spark change. So you don't want to kind of rock the boat too much, but you're like, hey, I got some great ideas. I think I know I can make a difference here. How do I do that? And then there's the challenge of honoring legacy and leading forward. There's another challenge of tension we have as leaders where, you know, if you're in an organization that's been around 50 years or 10 years and the owner has poured their heart and soul into the organization, you know, the last thing they necessarily need is for somebody to come in and say, well, you know, it's okay what's going on here, but I've got, you know, 10 great ideas that I think are way better than what's happening. And there's nothing that's more unsettling for existing leaders to feel that they're being shaken. So we want to try and strike this balance between, you know, getting our influence out there, but also doing it in a way that's respectful. The third element on this area is just, you know, this notion of, am I going to just get my head down and work like a dog, which is what most of us do? Or how do I begin to lead with purpose and passion in a way that signals that I'm going to put my hand up? I want to start getting engaged here. And so all of you are toggling probably between these things. And we want to look at, you know, ways that you can now think about harnessing different approaches as you grow your leadership. So just going to start off with a very quick, simple little self-reflection with you, because all great leaders we know are very self-aware. So as we wade into our conversation today, I'd like to read off 4 statements. And I'd like you please to either have your digital pen or your pencil and paper there, however you're taking notes, and just mark down on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being low, 5 being high, how you rate yourself in these 4 areas. Number 1, I pause to spot the forces disrupting flow and chart my responses clearly. So on a scale from 1 to 5, how would you rank yourself right now? Are you the kind of person that steps back and kind of gets the lay of the land, or are you just really quickly moving into things and trying to find ways that you can create solutions fast, and maybe you have some missteps along the way? So give yourself a ranking there. Number 2, I actively shape a culture of trust and collaboration across my team and partners. Now, most of you would say, of course, I'm doing that. My question is, how are you shaping culture around that collaboration and trust? So you're making the connections, but how are you then extending yourself out and really trying to nurture that culture? So again, on a scale of 1 to 5. Number 3, I empower others to take ownership and solve problems closest to the action. Well, this is a trick question, isn't it? Because a lot of us think that we're doing that. And then we have a conversation with people and they say, oh my gosh, I feel so micromanaged. And I run into this with a lot of people that I work with, where they're feeling just overwhelmed with the care, let's put it in a gentle way, the care that they're getting from their leader. So on a scale of 1 to 5, how much are you letting people take the reins, and how much are you saying, no, you better do it my way because I'm proven and tested and I've earned the right, with my experience to guide you. Number 4, I use my strengths and insights to keep supply chains moving under pressure. Again, you're doing this, but how are you actually leveraging and communicating your strengths and insights? You all have them, but the issue is, how are you using this to create influence? So by now, you've given yourself a little bit of a ranking. What I'd like you to do now is choose the one area that you're the strongest in. So just maybe put a circle around what that is. Is it spotting forces? Is it shaping trust, etc.? And now I want you to please identify the area in these 4 areas that you want to work more on. So what I'd like to do now is to have that area that you want to work more on kind of top of mind as we go through the next part of our conversation about what is shaping leadership. And then I want to get into some nuts and bolts with you that you can really take away. So 3 revelations I want to share with you that have, certainly influenced the way I work with organizations, certainly the way that people are thinking about how leadership now is less of a commodity and more of an embodied way of being. Leadership now is a pressing business issue. 75% of people that were recently surveyed in a Haymarket survey said that their boss is the worst part of their job. Can you believe that? 75%. Their boss is the worst part of their job. People are leaving organizations. 40% of people are unhappy, 30% feeling more isolated. And so what we're finding now is that leadership, senior leadership, and boards are paying attention to those statistics. And they're saying, what are we doing to really bring things up to a better level here? What are we doing? And so questions are going to be asked. Don't be surprised if you go for your next job and you get asked the question, what is your philosophy of leadership? Don't be surprised if you get that question. My question to you right now is, do you have a response? Because a mature leader will be able to say, yes, I have a philosophy that rests on these 3 pillars, whatever they may be for you, your values, your ethics, your morals, etc., your connectivity. And so it's really thinking about how you portray yourself and how leadership is actually making a definitive difference in the business. A good leader is running a strong business. And that leads us to our second revelation, which is that the old models of leadership aren't just outdated, but I think they're dangerous. Now, many of you may have been to a leadership program, 5 years ago or 3 years ago. And of course, what I'm telling you is what all your speakers have said to you this earlier today is that things have changed so much, we cannot operate the same way with our supply chain. And that means we can't apply that to our leadership. We need to change with what's going on right now. And a lot of people say, oh, you know what, I'm being a much more relational leader. And I say to them, well, I'm glad that, that you're being nice to people, but relational leadership is really a system and a process of how we enact leadership. And the old way of leading is basically we focused on who was leading, what they were leading, when and where they were leading, and why they were leading. The largest question right now in leadership is how we lead. It is the least understood. It's the least researched. It's what I've been spent the last 10 years beavering away on, really understanding the connections and the practices that have to happen to make leadership more of a rocket fuel for your productivity and your profitability. And the third revelation is that, there's a lot of people that talk about soft skills in a very demeaning way, that soft skills are weak. I worked in an organization a couple of years ago that called it pink and fluffy. What has this got to do with running our business? We don't really need to think about this. But in fact, all the research indicates is that if you can take all those hard skills you have, all of the new soft skills you're going to enhance and acquire, that is the multiplier effect that is going to drive growth. It is going to drive change. It is going to drive commitment, and it is going to drive innovation. And that's all of the research underscores that. So that's just me creating for all of us here a little bit of a context around why this is so important at this moment in our leadership. And this leads, of course, to where we are right now. Many of you have probably heard the term that we're in a VUCA world. For those of you who are not familiar with the term, it's a world that is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And what happens when we're in this kind of a world is that oftentimes we have paralysis, we make judgments and assumptions that are dated, we rely too heavily on our past experience and don't have enough sort of foresight, if you will, to start to really appreciate what's coming at us and how to process it. And so my caution right now is all of us kind of are inundated, as your previous speakers just said, with all of these changes that are around us. My question and my hope today as we have our conversation is, what are we going to do about it from a leadership perspective? So I'd like to give you 3 case studies, and I'd like to give you 3 sets of practices that I hope you can take away with you as you move in your leadership journey. And the 3 case studies are rooted on things that Supply Chain Canada thought was super important at this moment. They want us to focus on complexity, of course. They want us to think about empowerment and how important that is. And they want us to really, really think about nurturing culture. And when these 3 things come together, you've got a beautiful culmination of positivity, optimism, and ways that you can really engage people and take you with the journey with the journey that you're on right now. So our first case study is probably known to many of you. It's the Airbus case study, and it's a supply chain story where all of a sudden they were having massive problems with receipt of engines. And Guillaume Fleury, who is the CEO, really began to take hold of the situation and realize the gravity of it as media started reporting, customers were unhappy, employees were scared. There was just this total paralysis in the organization. He said, enough, that enough is enough here. And what we want to start doing is really creating a system and a process with the leadership to address these issues. And so he very, very systematically began to reach out to the vendors. He began to reach out to the employees. He began to understand, like, what are the puts and takes that are going on here? Why are we experiencing these challenges, and what can we do about them more importantly? Now, once he did that, he got the lay of the land. He sort of said, okay, there's political situations, there's economic factors, there's all kinds of technological issues, global, infrastructure, et cetera. And then he started making sense of it. That allowed him to make a declaration that Airbus was going to begin the process of creating, I think it was 72 planes a month by 2027. And so he put a stick in the ground. He said, this is what we're going to do. And why we can do it is because I've had all this consultation. And then he rejigged the systems and the processes within Airbus. So they were still building planes, but he created a whole new way of working with the organization where they took what they call the gliders, that is the planes with no engines, parked them over to the side, but they kept building. And then as soon as the engines came in, they installed the engines and got them delivered. And so that really changed the whole dynamic. Now, you can imagine this is a massive change effort in such an era of complexity, but it worked. And what we learn here is that really Guillaume took 3 steps, and I'd like to present the 3 steps to help you navigate complexity right now. And this is illustrated in our story. The first one was really spotting the forces. He didn't just do guesswork. He really got out there, and he obviously had all kinds of data and reports, but he listened to people. He looked them eye to eye. He talked to them. He understood the complexity of the situation. And is it doable that we could deliver this many planes a month? Can we do this? And they're like, yes, under this and this circumstance, we can do it. So first thing for you, I want you to think about an issue that you're dealing with right now. Could be anything, could be something happened last week, could be something that you think is coming at you. And think about the forces and trends that are a part of this issue that you're dealing with. Is it political? Is it economic? Is it technological? Is it regulatory? Is it governmental? Is it advocacy? What is the root of the issue? And then you want to begin charting your response, which we saw he also did, was really trying to figure out, what is a best case scenario? What is a worst case scenario? Strategic foresighting. What are the things that are coming at me, the 3 or 4 different ways that I could respond? And what do I do if A happens and then D happens and then X happens, and having those responses ready? So charting the response is very, very important. And what we want to do right now is really think about how you guide others in that whole process, and thinking about what can be done? What are the 3 or 4 things that we can do right now that are going to make a difference, that are really going to help us as we evolve and change? And who do we have to talk to? What channels do we have to use? And what are people most receptive to, and how are we going to get feedback? So that's one way that you can think about having 3 practices, right? Arrows in your quiver where you can really start to think about navigating complexity. Let's look at the second case study. And I chose Maersk here for a number of reasons. It's a bold story. It's certainly a story that we're all very familiar with. And you'll recall that with all of the rebel attacks, that there was a moment of incredible, just horrifying incidents going on at sea. We know that 12% of all of the goods and services in the world flow through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. And here's Maersk, one of the leading distributors of that, facing attacks on their people. On January 24th of 2025, Maersk made the very courageous decision and said, you know what? Safety is everything right now. We cannot have any more ships, our crews, our vendors, anything being impacted by this danger. And so they made a very public statement. Again, they came out on a public way after doing a lot of consultation to say, what are we going to do here to really empower our people to get through these times? And what they did was quite brilliant. They decentralized. And so you can imagine this was very much a top-down organization, and all of the complexity of the supply chain was being analyzed at the top and then being filtered down. And with this crisis, the CEO, Vincent Clerc here, who you see, led the charge and said, you know what? We need to create regional hubs that are responsible for their region, and we need to help and train them to do things that they maybe haven't done before, but I know they can do it. And certainly he had the confidence of his people. And this is another key thing, is giving trust to people as opposed to making people grovel and earn trust. He was like, I know they can do it with the right guidance. And as we look at what happens here, I'm going to give you the 3 keys of empowerment that Clerc used in this incredible crisis he had. And the first was sparking learning and looking at, is it safe here to try and fail? And he gave permission for all of these regional hubs, as they were plotting all these new courses around the world, to be able to say, look, we tried this, but it didn't work, but let's tell the other hubs that this did work and this didn't work, and this is what we're going to do and what we're not going to do. And that really began to solidify the base of knowledge, right? Of sparking the learning. It's a lot like COVID. When COVID first hit, everybody was trying to figure out what to do. And all of a sudden, you even had people that were direct competitors to each other, phoning each other and saying, hey, what are you doing? This is what I'm doing. Is it working? This kind of thing. So this is a really important first key you want to put in the door, is sparking the learning. The second one is lifting the potential. And so as a leader, what did Clerc do? He didn't just run off willy-nilly. He was like, okay, what do we have to do from a developmental perspective? I asked you what your biggest strength and your biggest development area was at the beginning of our conversation. And he did the same thing. He analyzed where they needed the training, where they needed the development. He gave them the tools and he said, go. And he was like, I trust you right now, go. And then the third thing is about coaching and mentoring, of course, because we're going to be able to help people with tools and resources, but leaders coach. Great leaders are great coaches. And the difference between coaching and mentoring is very, very important. I find in most of my client engagements, people don't really know the difference between coaching and mentoring. Don't be one of those leaders. A great mentor is going to say, hey, here are 5 things that I did, in my career that I think are going to help you, and you should do them. And you're like, oh, those are great tips. Thanks a million. A great coach is going to say to you, hey, this is a situation that you're currently facing. Let me please ask you 3 or 4 questions that will help you find the solution yourself. That's a huge distinction. The answer lies within the person who you're coaching. And it's having that ability to step back, to listen very carefully, to ask very thoughtful kinds of questions, You can ask miracle questions, for example. If I was to give you a magic wand and this would all go away, what would you do? These are the kinds of questions that people say, geez, what would I do if I had a magic wand? Well, I do this, and I do this. And you're like, exactly. Now, why don't you go do it? And so these are the kinds of keys that really, really help take your leadership to the next level. Let's go to the third case study, and I've chosen here Patagonia for you. And many of you are probably wearing Patagonia jackets here, there, and everywhere. You know the brand, I'm sure. And Patagonia has a mantra about serving the whole earth. That's their big, hairy, audacious vision. They want to serve the whole earth. And that worked up until it didn't. And that's the challenge, right? So what we saw was with Patagonia is they had all of these incredible benefits and they attracted all of these social justice warriors to come and work with them. And then unfortunately, the recession hit, the post-COVID world hit, and they had to restructure. They had to let 1% of their workforce go. And all these people that had been engaged and bought into the dream said, this company's lost its soul. And you can imagine the horror of the leadership team having to make these terrible decisions, but there are financial realities, which we all need to deal with as leaders. Leaders, as we know, are ever pragmatic. But the challenge is that they had to reimagine the company using that same culture, but adding new things to it, maybe decreasing a little bit of some of what they did, and being very open about mistakes they made. So when they first, went out and had to do all these restructurings and layoffs, they were quite brutal about it. And the backlash on social media was devastating. And imagine that they've got a director of philosophy at Patagonia who wrote a book of lessons from the layoffs. And he distributed that to all the organization. They brought back internships. They allowed 2 months off leave to do social activism. They sent all these signals. We've got daycare on site. We're going to do all of these things to help reinvigorate looking after this whole earth, which is what we do at Patagonia. And so these moments are going to happen to all of us in our leadership. Things are going to shift and change, and we've got to go with them. We've got to pivot to them, right? And so these are the things that are so important. So when we look at that, we see that there's 3 ways that you can nurture culture here. And very much we saw as the leadership team there owned their influence. They wrote a book, they distributed it, they just communicated night and day about the changes that they were making to the good. They tried to cultivate trust and, just thinking about that term of earned trust and granted trust. And there's a huge chasm between the two. Do I have to work for 3 or 4 years in order to earn your trust? Or if I come in as a new hire, you're going to say, Jill, I trust you right now. And that's a big distinction. And gathering everybody around this campfire, how do I help move everybody forward together? So these are the litmus tests of leadership in the year that we find ourselves of this incredible difficulty of change and disruption. And what I want for all people in the supply chain world is to be able to use these practices to drive your resilience, to drive your collaboration. And I'd like to end by asking you a question that, when you think about leadership, and all of the components, it really is its own supply chain. Great leaders, every breath they take, every move they make, every action they have either makes or breaks the strength of the company. And that's what you're doing every day in your job. So I really thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. And I hope if you have time that you might be able to take a look at my book, which is called The Compassion Advantage, which is 7 interlocking practices. We've talked about 3 of them today. And I hope that this was beneficial to you as you think about your leadership and you think about the kinds of things that you're hoping Supply Chain Canada will be able to support you with as you grow your career, your team, and your company. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jill. And I do encourage everyone to, if you don't have a copy of Jill's book, to go and get it. We had Jill's organization join us at the national conference in Calgary in June. And the presentation from your team, Jill, was so moving that the books were just completely sold out by the end of the conference. Again, I sort of take that back and say, it's just not the presentation itself. I think it is a recognition from everyone too, back to what you were saying at the beginning of your presentation, that leadership is our most pressing business issue, isn't it? And Jill, if you can maybe even share our recent experience, and we as part of Supply Chain Canada, we bring together executive leaders in the supply chain space to be a part of this Supply Chain Leaders Council, and we brought this issue and topic to them, Jill, and we shared this same deck, but even greater with them. Can you share some of the learnings that we took out of that session with those supply chain
Absolutely,
leaders?
yeah, for sure, Alan. And I'd like to, just really give a shout out to Supply Chain Canada for identifying leadership as a business issue for your profession, because I think it's going to give supply chain organizations across Canada such a competitive advantage. And what we really talked about when we had the leaders of the council get together were 3 or 4 major areas where we begin to thinking about how we evolve our leadership. The first was developing greater self-awareness. And so really we can't ask anybody to change if we don't change. We have to be able to say, I can look myself in the mirror. I can see where my area of strength is. I can see where my area of development is. And you know what? I'm going to get feedback. Please, team, give me feedback. And boss, give me feedback. Peers, give me feedback so I can get more and more, sort of in tune with the culture, that I can contribute to it in a meaningful way. Let me please be more compassionate. And we talked also a lot about the difference between compassion and empathy. And a lot of people think they're the same thing, but they're actually not. If it's great to be empathetic. I mean, if I'm empathetic, it means I know I walk a mile in Alan's shoes and I say, oh, geez, Alan, I really appreciate the kind of work you're doing. I feel it. But if I'm compassionate, would I say, hey, Alan, I know you're trying to do all of this great work and you're under so much stress and issues or whatever it may be. What can you and I do together to help you? And compassion really is about taking action. So it's empathy and action. And so what we tried to do in our sessions with the Leadership Council was we would give a knowledge nugget about what the topic was of the 7 interlocking practices. We would weave in examples from the real supply chain world because everybody was giving us examples that we could use. And then we were applying the practices. And so everybody had an opportunity to experiment. They were in role plays together. They would have self-assessments and they would look at where they stood in various things. And then they would be able to say, okay, here is my action plan. And everybody left with a bit of a blueprint as to what they were going to do differently. We supplied them with support so that we're available at any time for them to have a chat with us. And, we're ready there to take questions or to give them, some examples of what they could do and make it very practical. Now, we also fused in some things on innovation and strategic foresighting. We didn't have, tons of time to do that, but I also want to emphasize that part of being a great leader, as I said, that new math, when you saw that slide with the soft skills and the hard skills, we also weave in, right, the innovation. How, like, what are the top most hot to trot methods right now of being innovative? And so I've been researching for the last year, and I've got an action-packed 2-day masterclass on innovation, as well as on strategic foresighting. So that kind of blends in with the hard and the soft skills.
Absolutely. One of the things that stood out for me from those sessions is we sort of started off with, okay, how does leadership affect us? And everyone had stories of bad bosses, bad leaders, and then also a few stories of some great bosses. And so when we had great leaders around, just the amount of empowerment and great things that can happen. And then conversely, when you don't have someone in that place. And it was interesting because we sort of went from that conversation to saying, to the extent that leadership impacts you, how can you take ownership of that? And how can you be a leader that impacts others. And that was a really, really powerful statement. I just want to share maybe the last piece here, which is the rollout of the Supply Chain Leadership Academy. And so we're really excited about this. We're going to have the inaugural class in fall of 2025, and we're going to pilot this class with a number of supply chain executive leaders. And through that, would love to come back and share with this group how that went, and really how do we then take that and then develop a leadership program for all supply chain professionals, right? Because leadership doesn't only apply to those that manage people. It applies to everyone.
So true, Alan.
Okay, holy smokes, that puts us at the very end of this session. Jill, thank you so much for your presentation.
Oh,
That was
thank
really,
you.
really insightful and moving. I've taken some additional notes. Every time I listen to you, I learn something new. Just quickly here, as we're reaching towards the end of our forum, I want to thank everyone for your participation. Holy smokes, 3.5 hours go by so fast, and you have all stayed around and have been very, very engaged in your listening. Thank you so much for participating today. I want to thank, in particular, our sponsors as well. Fair Supply, Kinetic GPO, thank you so much. Thank you to all of our partners, CITT, the province of British Columbia, Logistics BC, and also Langara College to be such great partners of ours for Supply Chain Week BC. As an organization that has been around for over a century, servicing Canada and advocating for supply chain professionals and the adoption of best practices. At the end of the day, as I said at the beginning, it's all about this community of supply chain professionals, and the fact that you're all here contributing and contributing to this learning and continuous improvement really, really excites me on what we can do together going forward as well. I hope you've enjoyed our session today, and I hope to see those in BC join our in-person events that are happening throughout this week as well. Have a wonderful day. Thank you for joining us, and talk to everyone soon. Bye for now.